Yeah, I think we're going to get ready and get started. Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. Happy New Year to you all. And welcome to the EAAC, the Emergency Access Advisory Committee's January 11th, 2013 meeting. I'm going to get started first with the roll call. I'm going to start with the folks who are in the room, and then we'll move to the folks on the conference bridge. First, Bernard Aboba.
Here.
Angel Arocho. Shelley Blakeney. Jim Coleman. Ronnie Cotton. Brian Daly. Brian Daly?
Brian's here. He should unmute.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Brian. Tony Dunn. Tony Dunn. David Zumba.
Here, I'm here.
Good morning, David.
Good morning.
Jean-Paul Imard. Sherry Farina, I see her here on the video conference. Lori Flaherty.
Good morning, this is Lori. I'm on the bridge.
Mark Fletcher.
Good morning.
Good morning. Jessica Gabriel. Oh, one of our interpreters. Okay. Matthew Gerst. Kevin Green. Hello. Eric Hagerson. Good morning. Gunnar Hellstrom. Brian Yosef. Brian Yosef. Brendan Casper.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning. Marty Kinder. Hello. Cheryl King. Not here. Rebecca Ledoux. Rebecca Ledoux. Chris Littlewood. Bob Mather. Bruce McFarland.
I'm on the bridge. I'm here.
Yeah, he was on the other. I sent it to you and
Good morning.
Katrina, the full document, and there's a paragraph of information.
Paul Michaelis.
Good morning. I'm on the bridge.
Christian Milito.
I'm here. I'm on the bridge.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hillary Martinson. Don Mitchell. Good morning. Peter Musgrove.
Peter's here.
And Zenji Nakazawa. And Donna Platt. I see on the video conference. Richard Ray, that's myself. Marcy Roth. Oh, I'm sorry, and Gay Jones. Is Gay Jones here? Laura Ruby?
Yes, I'm here.
Victoria Ryan? Oh, an interpreter as well. Brian Scapelli? Hello? Susan Sherwood?
Here.
And I see Susie Rosen Singleton, of course. John Snap. Al Sonnenstrahl, I see. Karen Strauss here as well. Mark Stern, I see. Greg Vanderheiden. Greg?
Greg will be on and off on the phone.
Okay. Arnaud Van Wyck. Arnaud? Christian Vogler. Jennifer, another interpreter, and Norm Williams. Joel Zev.
Joel Zev here on the bridge.
Roger Hickson.
Yes, I'm here on the bridge.
Hello, Roger. Kathy McMahon.
Yes, I'm on the bridge.
Great. Are there any names that I have not called who are in attendance?
David Firth of the FCC.
Anyone else that I have not called? Okay, thank you. Next item on our agenda is to review the minutes from our previous meeting. Has everyone had an opportunity to review those minutes? And if so, can I hear a motion or a motion to either accept or a motion to revise those minutes? Any corrections to the minutes from our previous meeting? Then do I hear a motion to accept the minutes?
Paul Michaelis, I move to accept the meeting minutes, please.
Do I hear a second? A second from Al Sonnenstrahl? All those in favor of accepting the minutes as they are written? Seeing no opposition, minutes are accepted. Next item on our agenda is a report from Zenji
Thank you.
Nakazawa from a report on the text to 911 rulemaking proceeding and consumer outreach efforts and other public safety and Homeland Security Bureau activities of interest to the EAC. I'll turn it over to you, Zenji.
Thank you. With permission of the chairs, I'd like to cede my time to David Firth, the Deputy Bureau Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau.
Certainly.
Thank you, Zenji, and good morning, everybody. I am actually going to cede my time back to Zenji in just a moment, but I wanted to come to our first meeting of the new year to wish everyone a happy new year, and to say in particular a thank you to everybody on the EAAC, both individually and collectively, for the work that you have done to this point, and in particular the work that has helped us to get to where we are on text to 911. The further notice that the Commission adopted in December, which Zenji will talk about and which I know you are all quite familiar with, was a major accomplishment. It would not have happened without the work of people at this table and on the phone for many months and years, in fact, before we got to that point. And so I just wanted to express my appreciation, the Bureau's and the Commission's appreciation. We still have a great deal of work ahead of us. The comment cycle, as you're probably aware, has been set for the text to 911 item. It was published in the Federal Register on Wednesday. And we have a number of other issues, and Zenji is going to talk about them in a little bit more detail, that are very important to our overall 911 efforts and to the work of this committee. And I really look forward to working with everyone here. I will just mention a couple of other things that, again, I think you were aware of. If you read this morning's Washington Post, you were aware of the report that the Bureau put out yesterday with respect to the derecho and the impact that the derecho had on communication systems, and particularly on 911. And this is an extremely important part of our overall efforts to examine the 911 system, both as it affects network reliability and resiliency, and ultimately as it affects the ability of the public to obtain help when they need it in major emergencies. So even though it is not a direct issue on the agenda of this committee, it's nonetheless very important, I think, to all of our thinking about moving to next generation 911 and all of the different aspects of that to make our 911 system more resilient and more accessible. We're also working on, and Zenji will also talk a little bit about this, a report to Congress that will be due in late February, in which we're going to be making recommendations to Congress on the general legal and regulatory framework for next generation 911. This was a provision that was part of last year's legislation that did a number of things in the public safety arena, last February's legislation that did a number of things in the public safety arena, including a number of things relating to next generation 911. One of the things that Congress did was to actually adopt a piece of the Commission's broadband plan and a recommendation that we go to Congress and make recommendations about things that Congress could potentially do to help create a legal and regulatory framework that is appropriate for and will speed the transition to next generation 911. We put out a public notice back in November in which we sought input on that. I know we've had comments that were filed in the record in December. We'll be having reply comments filed next week. I know among other groups that filed comments in the initial round was the Wireless RERC, and there were a number of others that also filed. And we're looking at those comments very actively now and working, and we'll continue to work very closely with others within the Commission and outside the Commission to come up with a good set of recommendations for Congress. So I wanted to highlight that as well. And with that, I'm going to have to take my leave. I apologize, but I have an 11 o'clock meeting, but Zenji will be able to walk through a number of these and other issues and ongoing things that we are working on with you during the later part of the meeting. But again, I just want to express my deep appreciation for everything that everyone here has done, and I look forward to continuing to work with all of you in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you, David. A couple of things just for housekeeping. I wanted to mention that the public notice many of you saw that we released on January 9th established an outline of when the comments would be due regarding the text to 911 further notice of proposed rulemaking. So comments for the bounce back issue. The bounce back issue to an automatic mechanism to prevent and to eliminate any kind of confusion of whether that capability currently exists. The comments for that issue are due January 29th, and the replies February 8th. The rest of the NPRM Section 3A, the remainder, that is, those comments are due March 11th and April 9th. The bounce back issue is very important to us, and we are motivated to, our aim is to get an order out by late March, the April timeframe. As David had also mentioned, we are working on a statutory report to Congress. We issued a public notice in November, and this report is due to Congress on February 22nd. The main focus, of course, is looking at the NG 911 legal framework. This really started out with the National Broadband Plan, had mentioned this, and it had come into fruition with the NG 911 Act. And we're looking at, in particular, governance issues of 911 as we enter and transition into the age of digital IP networks. And with the sunset of the public switch network, we're looking at how will and what type of technology standards should we adopt going forward into this transition. But more importantly, Congress has asked us to look at the governance issues, in particular about state and federal dichotomy, and the legal authority for either the federal government to take the stand on certain issues or states to take the lead on other issues. That is my main update for today. I also just wanted to let folks know that there is a webinar on the state of 911 on June 24th, and that's from 12 to 1. I'll have more details, or at least some of that information will be transmitted to Susie, and we can segue with folks out there. Thank you, and I'm always open to questions.
We have a question from Al in the room. This is Al, representing CSD. With regards to the NPRM on text to 911, what role will our report have in that process?
That report will be part of the record and will actually play a very instrumental role in outlining and establishing standards and also procedures for going forward and implementing that. So the work here in this committee is highly relevant and directly on point, so it will have a lot of weight.
This is Richard. I have Lori Flaherty on the hand-raising tool. Lori, do you have a question?
Just a point of clarification. If anyone wants more information on the webinar, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau will be presenting an update, and it is scheduled for Wednesday, January 24th from 12 to 1. And I'd be happy to take any questions people might have with regard to how to sign up for that.
Thank you, Lori. Christian? I'd like to ask if you have any comments on the status of accessible emergency notifications through television, as the FCC recently received reply comments on accessible emergency information on television for the blind community. And we are concerned that deafblind people and deaf people with low vision are left with nothing truly accessible to them.
As you know, as you just pointed out, this is Karen speaking, for those of you who are on the phone. We do have an open proceeding on accessible accessible information provided about emergencies on television. That's under the CVAA. The CVAA, however, only directs us to address the issues with respect to people who are blind or have visual impairments. We are reviewing the comments now. I don't know, I haven't reviewed them myself, but I'm sure that the staff will look carefully at them and we'll see what kind of comments we've gotten. I don't know if we've gotten comments on people who are both deaf and blind.
We have filed such comments.
Well, we will be looking at those comments and reviewing them and determining what is our next action. We are under a legal obligation under the CVAA to issue final rules for the delivery of accessible content, emergency content, by April of this year. So that's fairly soon. We will be conferring with you and other consumer groups as well as the industry as we move forward with finalizing those rules.
This is Richard Ray. Any further questions for Mr. Nakazawa or for Karen? Gunnar?
Yeah, Gunnar Hellström here. In the text to 911 work, have you also been asking the mainstream people, non-accessibility people? There is a function we have been forced to put aside here, that is having a voice call and getting text out to the user. That's a general function that is used in many call centers and looks very simple to do, and would be strange to omit it for the general public, and we could benefit from it in the accessibility field as well. Why don't we have that, and can you take it on for the general public instead?
That issue has been raised in the comments, and it is an issue that we're going to carry forward. I think there, as you mentioned, great synergies between the different communities, and so I think that's definitely an issue that we're looking at.
So you are also getting comments. You are getting comments from the general public, not only from accessibility side.
Yes, that's correct.
Good.
Any further questions before we move on to our next agenda item? Seeing none. Thank you. Next, we will be moving on to a topic which is an update on CVAA and report on next steps and scope for the EAAC from Karen Pelt-Strauss. Karen?
Thank you. This is Karen, and I don't have a whole lot more to report on CVAA. I think I've brought you pretty much up to date. The only other thing I want to mention is that the proceeding that Christian just mentioned, that we just talked about for emergencies on TV, also has a device component where video programming devices also have to be capable of passing through the information that is accessible to people who are blind and visually impaired. We are actually not required to issue our rules until October for the devices, but the proceeding that's open addresses both issues, and so we may be beating our deadline on the device end as well and issuing those rules. And this is not firm for any of you who are watching this on the web. This is not a firm statement, but it probably makes sense to issue the rules all together. So at least that's going to be something that we strive for. We also this spring will be taking up the issue of accessible user interfaces so that blind and visually impaired people can interact with the television. The voice menus, or rather the on-screen menus, would have to have some kind of audio component so that people who are blind and visually impaired can change the channel, can select a program, can see what's on or decipher what is on television at any given time, as well as a provision that requires that it be a bit easier for people who need to access video description and captioning to actually get those accessible features. I just got back from the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas and was very excited to see several of the video device manufacturers jumping the gun on this issue. I was able to see firsthand 3 different companies demonstrate voice-activated televisions, and one of those companies actually had audio back for the viewers. So it's always really thrilling to see when companies don't wait for deadlines, regulatory deadlines, and take it upon themselves. Also, what was exciting was that I viewed this information or viewed these displays with a lot of other people who were very excited about it. And as usual, when you incorporate accessible features, they end up benefiting everybody. And so the companies that were demonstrating this were not necessarily focusing even on people with disabilities, but rather touting this as the latest and greatest way of interacting with your TV. So they're very exciting. Also at the convention, I'm very proud to say that the chairman had a one-on-one session with Gary Shapiro, who is the chairman, who is the CEO of the Consumer Electronics Association. And during that session, for at least 10 minutes, the two discussed the CVAA and accessibility and the importance of incorporating accessibility during the design stages of developing and designing a product. That was truly thrilling to see that at a convention that had 3,000 plus exhibitors, and to have the chairman of the FCC deliver that very important message, and the fact, as he put it, that accessible design does not hinder innovation, can instead promote innovation, and at the same time that we strive here to not overly burden industry, that we work with industry and design, are working towards accessible design and innovation within the constraints of industry's practices and its rollout of products and services. So it was very exciting for me to be there and to see this accessibility issue at the forefront of the regulatory discussion. So I don't know if any of you have any other questions on the CVAA or anything else that we're doing on the CVAA. There are some rules that are going into effect now. The record-keeping obligations are going into effect at the end of this month. So those companies that are subject to the advanced communication services requirements must start keeping records at the end of this month, and then must file certifications by April 1st that they're keeping such records, documenting their efforts to provide accessibility. The video description rules are in effect. The IP captioning rules, many of which are already in effect. The National Deafblind Program just completed its first 6 months of the distribution of equipment for people who are deafblind. Some of the states have been a little slower than others, but on the whole, we could not be happier with how this has been rolling out. It's been extraordinary to see it be implemented and to see this population get the equipment that they need to become independent and productive. I think that's about it for the CVAA. Any questions? Yes.
Mark Fletcher with Avaya. Thanks for that, Karen. I appreciate that. At the CES, was there any discussion about the proliferation of text to 911 apps that we're starting to see come on the market today that require someone to actually load an application and use that application, as opposed to what I'll call native text to 911?
Right.
Because that concerns me.
Yeah, I did not see any discussion of that. Although I will tell you that if you've ever been to CES trying to catch everything that goes on there is quite a challenging feat. I know that there were many exhibitors showing apps, and I would not be surprised if they were there.
There were a few that did make the news articles, so I would just caution the group to watch for those to make sure that those apps are following guidelines established by the EAC, as well as Nina just put out a document this year on app development.
Thank you. And as you know, that is one of the issues that's raised in our text to 911 proceeding.
Thank you.
I also wanted to mention, I will be getting to the task of this committee in a second, but before I turn away from general accessibility issues, I also wanted to mention that last month we held our second annual Chairman's Awards for Advancement in Accessibility. Some of you were here to celebrate that. A wonderful way of showcasing the extraordinary achievements by innovators and researchers and engineers who have taken the initiative to develop accessibility solutions. And we gave those awards and had a display of those new technologies here at the center. They may even still be here. I'm not sure. They might be in our tech center. I think some of them are still there if you want to stop by. Again, this is a way of applauding those who have taken the initiative, and maybe we'll see one in the area of emergency services next year. This year, unlike last year was general, it was open. This year we actually had categories focusing on things like education, civic affairs, etc. And if any of you have an interest in having one maybe on emergency services next year, we can do that as well. But again, that's just another way that this commission, I think, has shown its dedication to not only implementing what we're directed to do under the CBAA, but working with industry on voluntary measures, cooperative, collaborative, and other measures to which everyone can agree are good solutions for achieving accessibility. So why don't I move into this committee, and I'm going to deliver what I hope will be good news, at least for most of you, which is that although you may have thought that this was your last meeting, we have been successful in extending your charter, or at least extending your reign. And you will see a public notice that goes out today extending your tenure for 6 months. We received support to extend your work from various of you, well, not from the committee itself, from the EAAC chairs, co-chairs, from Nina, and from the consumer groups, and then more recently, in the last day or so, from APCO. So we know that you asked for 3 months, but as a safety net, we gave you 6. You are free to use whatever you like. If you are finished within 3, you can hang up your hats and your coats and say, you have what we've needed to give you and we're done. But if you would like the full 6 months, you can take it. During this period, I think that more discussion needs to take place as to what will happen after that period of time. And we started engaging in a little bit of that discussion. But the reason that we took this action is because we understood that you still had reports that were unfinished. And if we re-charter, we would be doing so anew with new membership. And in order to preserve the existing membership who have already worked on the subcommittees, this was the easiest thing to do. We do believe that it is within our statutory authority to do so, because the statutory authority directs us to get reports from you and recommendations, and we understand that those were not finished. So in light of that, we understand that some of you on the subcommittees will be making your presentations today and scrambled to finish what you were working on, perhaps expecting this to be your last meeting. So you may want to caucus over lunch and determine whether you want to amend what you tell us today, whether you needed more time, or whether you want to present what you have and then still go back to the drawing board and tweak it a little bit more. In addition, the last time that you gave us a report, you did give us a consolidated report. So you may also want to think about whether in the next 3 to 6 months you would like to again consolidate what you've put together for today and put it again back into a comprehensive report voted on by the full committee. Al, just to, echo what Zenji said before, I don't think that we can emphasize strongly enough how important your recommendations are to this commission. Your recommendation were the foundation of some of our actions in the Text to 911 document, the FNPRM. That was obvious. You see the recommendations mentioned, and the expertise around this room, not only individually, but with respect to the breadth of the companies that you represent from the industry and consumers, is unparalleled on these issues. So, I've served on, many of you have served on many committees. I cannot emphasize to you how strongly we consider your recommendations. So, we are very pleased to announce, and while I was in at CES, I thank Zenji and Susie for doing the legwork on getting this public notice ready in record time, and I'm just so pleased to announce that you can continue your work. So then the next question that I think you are going to have to decide is how frequently you'd like to meet. We've gotten various different feedback from folks about whether monthly meetings are too often. So that's something that you'll need to decide in the next, today actually.
This is Wishard. Sherry has asked a question, but I want to take a moment to comment and make a clarification. I'd like to thank Laura Rudy and Brian Scapelli and also David Zumba with their assistance in the modifications in the letter that was submitted to the FCC. I would like to thank you for bringing some things to my attention. And there have been slight revisions made that I will be sure to send to you all at the end of this meeting. And I'm sure that will offer some clarification on things that have been confused in the past. So I wanted to express my personal thanks for that. And now I'd like to turn it over to Sherry for a question. So that was just Karen speaking, correct? I just wanted to make sure. Thank you, because I can't see you, Karen. Hello, everyone. This is Sherry. Happy New Year. I really appreciate that we've been given the opportunity to extend the EAAC and our time together for another 6 months. We haven't had a long amount of time for the NG 911 discussions, so I think that will be an area where we can switch our focus and buckle down with that with the EAAC. That's very, very exciting news that we'll be able to continue our work on that topic. And then related for what we've been working on in the past, related with Text to 911, the EAC needs to hear from you, the FCC, about timelines for the work that we've been doing and our recommendations and when those will need to be completed. Do you have any comments related with that you can give us now about timelines specifically for the reports? Karen?
I think that we are going to have to work with the Public Safety Bureau on the specific timelines. Zenji, I think that you mentioned that the bounce back rules are likely to come out at the end of March, beginning of April, around then.
Yes, that's correct.
And as you know, the industry has made a commitment to rolling out text to 911 by middle of May in 2014. So those are two timelines, and we will need to read the recommendations to determine when we think that we can implement the other timelines. So I can't make any commitment now, Sherry, and again, this is Karen, but we will definitely look at those carefully.
This is Richard speaking. I have a question, if I may ask one of you. It's in regards to the timelines as well. You just said May 2014, and I'm wondering if PSAP agrees to allow the SMS systems to be implemented in-house. I'm wondering how exactly that will work. If you could elaborate on that for us.
This is Karen. Remember that the mid-May date is the outer limits. So there's no prohibition against moving more quickly. And we've already seen rollouts in various communities. In addition, one of the nice things about this committee is that we have a representative from the Department of Justice here. And as you know, there is a parallel requirement for the public safety answering points to make their 911 systems accessible to people with disabilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, before this voluntary commitment was made, it was, as you all know, sort of a chicken and egg thing, which was going to move first. Well, now that there's momentum on the carrier side, I guess we're likely to see faster movement on the PSAP side. So again, there's nothing to stop the PSAPs from moving more quickly than the May date, than the 2014 date.
Do we have any further questions? Al? This is Al speaking. My birthday is May the 21st, so if we could make it on May the 20th of 2014, that would be the best birthday gift I could receive.
Well, Al, it's funny that you should say that. First of all, it's May 15th, so we've beaten your birthday. And I would tell you as an aside, my birthday was the implementation date of the IP captioning rules for requiring closed captioning on television. So I can understand your interest in having the birthday commemorate an important accessibility event.
Christian?
Yeah.
This is Christian speaking. Experiencing technical difficulties here. Okay. I can't speak on behalf of the consumer groups. However, we've been discussing the issue ad nauseum for a while. The consumer groups are extremely motivated to work with the public safety groups to encourage more proceedings with text to 911. So I believe that the FCC supporting our work with the in the public safety committees is really greatly appreciated.
Well, again, this is Karen. One of the nice things about this committee is the collaboration that has taken place. So we are looking forward to having that continue. And as I've mentioned before, over the next 6 months, and even after that, whether or not it's recharted, we're hoping that the collaboration continues. Any other questions? I do want to...
It seems that we have a question from Sherry.
Okay.
I think it's very important to reiterate that our work is going to be meaningless without hard timelines. So I'm not sure exactly what Christian had just commented, but I do want to reiterate that the timelines are necessary for us to do our work, and the consumer groups are asking for them. And not only timelines, but major milestones as well. And otherwise, it's all talk.
Again, Sherry, I think that we will look very closely at the timelines that you recommend. We strongly suggest that in your final report, you propose timelines, and we will take those into consideration. As you know, we have, as I said, 2 timelines already on the table, and would be amenable to considering additional timelines if they are agreed to by the group. We took into consideration very carefully the timelines that had been proposed as well by the Video Programming Access Advisory Committee, also created under the CVAA, and adopted those timelines with respect to IP captioning. Almost verbatim from what the group proposed. So if you have recommendations, I'm not promising that we can adopt them, but we will definitely consider them carefully. I do want to mention that although this is not your final meeting, it is one of your final meetings, and we wanted to thank you with a certificate. So staff was kind enough and fast enough to put together these beautiful certificates suitable for framing and hanging that are in appreciation of all of the work that you've done over the past 2 years and that you'll be doing over the next few months. So thank you again, and I will be around in and out throughout the day if you have any other questions.
And any final questions for Karen?
This is Roger Hickson. Could I be allowed to make a comment in regard to Sherry's commentary?
Yes, Roger.
Okay, now that we have an extension that's real, and the assumption, as I understand it, is that EAC and, as a result, Subcommittee 1 or Work Group 1, depending on how you refer to it, will continue work on this, I would refer you to the last recommendation in the report that you'll be getting this morning, about the need to develop a deployment plan from which arises timelines and milestones and intermediate time frames. And people who do this kind of work, I think, are well aware, I would hope that's most of the people on this call, are well aware that you don't get to end objectives unless you develop milestones and intermediate objectives and meet those dates so that you can get things in place to make this work. An example that hasn't been really discussed so far in the education area is that, yes, we need to educate call takers, we do need to educate the public, do need to educate people in the carrier environment, and probably other stakeholder groups of various kinds. But we also need to develop some education for public safety as to what they need to be able to do before it comes time to actually train the call taker, but what public safety organizations need to do to prepare for text to 911. And that's an education piece that needs to be developed probably in the next 2 to 3 months, so that people out in the public safety environment know what's going on, know what the relationships are, and know what they need to consider and how they need to fund things, such as training, but also possibly interface improvements, so that text to 911 can operate effectively. So we will need to put together a further development plan and a deployment plan, and generate milestones and timelines from that, which I certainly agree should be in the next report for the EAC. Thanks.
This is Karen. This is Karen. That was Roger, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think that we could not agree more that education is going to be critical at this point. And as you know, our Consumer Outreach Division has already begun, as well as the Public Safety Division have already been working on consumer plans, and most definitely that would be within the scope of this committee, and we look forward to your recommendations on how to roll that out.
Matt Hurst.
Thanks. Matt Gerst with CTIA. Just a point of clarification to sort of follow up on the discussion, Karen, you pointed out about new work. The extension, can you clarify what the extension is being granted for? Are we being extended in our time to complete the work that we are already doing, or are you suggesting that that there may be new content or new reports that we're being authorized to consider? Because I think, what I understood the letter was that we're being extended to complete the work that we already have.
Yeah, primarily you are being extended to complete the work that you have already started. I think on the area of education and outreach, that is something that this committee has discussed in the past, so I would include that within that. But that is the primary purpose of the extension.
Thank you.
In that case, let me ask a further question. This is Roger Exon. Are we saying that doesn't include deployment planning?
Doesn't include the... Could you repeat the last part of your sentence?
Are we saying by that statement that the further extension and the work involved does not include the further development definitions and the implementation planning work that would be necessary to complete this project?
I think that what you're going to have to look at is how much that part of what you would like to recommend is an extension of what you've already started.
All right.
That's a legalistic response that you can interpret.
Yes, it certainly is.
I think Gunnar had a question.
Hellström here. We have a few subgroups who have been defined but barely made any work. They have halted of different reasons. Is that what you mean is started that we should try to complete? Or is it rather the ones who now have draft reports that we are just getting extra months to finish up really properly?
If you have subgroups that you had already created that had begun a discussion on something, I believe that would be considered within something that you already started and can complete your work. Any other questions? Thank you again, and again, we appreciate your work, and we'll be looking forward to continuing our work with you over the next few months.
Ms. Richard, thank you, Karen. So I'd like to ask the group now, are you ready to break for lunch? Would you like to take the opportunity now to take an hour for lunch, sort of mull over the information that we've just been given? The next item on the agenda is the report in regard to the rollout for Text 911, the discussion. So would you like to take a break now, or would you like to move forward? It's 11:30, so we're looking at breaking for lunch and coming back at 12:30. That seems to be consensus. All right, we'll see everyone back at 12:30. Thank you. Welcome back from lunch, everyone. I'd like to thank TCS and T-Mobile for providing our breakfast and lunch today. Thank you so much for the refreshments. I want to get back to the agenda where we left off. We will be picking up with the scope of the EAAC, talking about what our charter is, where we're going from here, and how we will manage to get there. I don't know if you remember, we submitted a report that included our recommendations on December of 2011. The report that was submitted at that time was not complete. It was outlining issues that needed to be addressed at that point. Because of the outstanding issues that had not been addressed, we established a number of committees. I believe there were 7 of them. Let me go through those to refresh your memory. Text to 911 was one of them. interoperability testing, PSAP, and sign language and other communication assistance. The fourth subcommittee was to complete an in-depth report to complete the detailed report sections. A fifth group to identify gaps in the NINA I3 compared to the EAAC recommendations. The sixth subgroup was to focus on TTY transition issues. And finally, a timeline alignment. And there's a draft available for that. So those were the 7 subgroups that were established. So we've had 7 active working groups. 3 that have been particularly active have been the Text to 911, the Sign Language Assistance and other communication assistance, and also the TTY transition group. The 4 other subcommittees have been slightly less active. And I'd like to talk about whether we want to revise those remaining 4 committees and the work that they're doing, or have them continue with their original assignments. If we'd like to disband them, we have a limited extension at this point of 6 months, so I'm not sure if that's enough time, if we have a sense of whether that's enough time to complete the work that we've been given. So I'd like your input and thoughts about those 4 subcommittees who have been less active, whether or not they should continue with their work, or whether that's necessary at this point. Another question I wanted to pose is how often we should meet. Should the full committee meet once a month? Is it important to meet on a monthly schedule in person, or should we use other methods for collaborating? So let's first tackle the question about the 4 working groups who are not hearing from today and what to do with their work. Does anyone have any feedback? Any brave soul want to put forth their thoughts? Don?
Yeah, Don Mitchell, one of the co-chairs of Subcommittee 7, along with Kevin Green. We've got our report in relatively close to final form, so it's really, at this point, we didn't push to get it completed in December because of all the activity on Subcommittee 1, and that's where most all of our reviewers and editors were working. So I would say our document doesn't need new content, just needs some final edits to wrap up. And I think a couple months would be all it would take for our document.
Okay, this is Richard. I have 2 people on the hand-raising tool. Sherry? Sherry, would you like to go ahead? Hi, everyone. This is Sherry. I just want to make sure that I understand your question about the other subcommittees. Are we asking whether or not those committees would somehow be merged into the other existing or active committees?
This is Richard. I'm having a hard time following the video connection, so I'm asking if Sherry can repeat her question, please.
This is Sherry again, just repeating. From my understanding, from Richard's comments, in regard to the subcommittees who haven't had the opportunity to really have that discussion, that they might possibly merge with some of the other committees that have been doing more of the work or more active. I think if we streamline our work and some of the committees we have to make sure that everyone's able to participate, because ultimately we're going to create one final report. So maybe those 4 subcommittees could work together to create one report to submit. This is Richard. Those committees probably could merge into one and submit one combined final report. I think that's possible. What does everyone else think? I have Bernard on the hand-raising tool.
Yes. I would like to comment on 2 of the subcommittees. One is the interoperability. Since that subcommittee
Can you hold on 1 second? Can you just give us 1 second? Someone in the room is asking for clarification on one of the issues. This is Richard. So Sherry brought up the idea of possibly merging those 4 remaining subcommittees so that they can work together to create one final report, or having them merge with some of the other subcommittees. So just basically rearranging the structure and merging some of the committees together. And we would do some analysis to figure out where they fit, where they best fit together. Okay, Bernard, I'm sorry about that. Go ahead.
I wanted to comment on 2 of the subcommittees. One of them was interoperability. Since that subcommittee was chartered, there has been some subsequent activity that I think may make the work of that subcommittee obsolete. As an example, the SIP Forum is chartering a VRS working group, which will produce a profile for the VRS as well as potentially a set of tests, interoperability tests. The SIP Forum has produced a series of tests also for voice and SIP trunking. And so given the charter of that VRS working group, it may produce much of what that interoperability committee would have produced. Also, we have had some advances in NINA ICE testing. Quite a lot has happened in that time. So I'm not clear that that committee really is needed at this point, and that there isn't already work which will be cited in forthcoming reports and orders that will cover that. With respect to the NINA I3 issues, I believe some of those things will also be included in the charter of the VRS profile group. That is, if they find something that can't be expressed, they work closely with the IETF and with NINA to try to get those things fixed. So I'll defer to Roger as to whether he thinks those issues are covered, but I would note that there is going to be work underway that would cover the work of both of those. Thank you.
This is Richard Bernard. So you're recommending that we do away with the interoperability subcommittee?
Yes.
Okay. And anyone else have comments on that? Or other folks in agreement?
This is Roger Hickson at NINA. I think if we are careful to make sure we know what the subject areas and issues are, that I would agree with that we can use other methods he mentioned to deal with the interoperability aspects as compared to having a separate EAC committee for it.
Okay, and Mark, and then Christian.
Mark Fletcher with Avaya. As co-chair of that interoperability committee with Al, I agree that if the work is being done outside of this group, that we certainly should be looking at that information and not recreating.
I'm sorry, Mark, can I ask you to hold on 1 second? I was asking Sherry, who's on the video conference, if she has a conference. So a comment, but I missed the beginning of your comments. Could you start over again? I apologize.
Certainly. Mark Fletcher with Avaya. As the co-chair with Al, of that interoperability group, I completely agree that we should not be performing work that's being already taken care of. There shouldn't be a duplicative effort. However, I think it's important that the EAC has some representation to review that data, and I think maybe the scope of that group should change from not investigating technologies, but to reviewing the recommendations by those other outside committees to make sure that they are in fact applicable to the EAC work.
Okay, Christian, you wanted to say something? This is Christian speaking. I'm actually co-chair, along with Brian Daly, of committee number 5, I believe it is, focused on the I3 standards and looking at the I3 standards and how they might merge with the EAC's recommendations and trying to identify where the gaps are. So I feel like that work is important. But first, I would like to hear from Roger. My understanding is that NINA has been also revising their standards for the I3, and we hope to address some of the issues that we've noticed in the last year that we've been working on those. So Roger, my question is specifically to you. Do you feel that work is still necessary, or do you feel like the issues that we've brought up have already been addressed in other places and other venues?
This is Roger Hickson. I can't guarantee that everything has been, but I think there's a process there that can make that happen. I think Mark's got a good idea there. Maybe those two groups ought to be combined in some way to monitor and, feedback and react to things that are going on elsewhere to make sure that the work is complete rather than it being totally ignored by EAC. I mean, EAC ought to know what's happening and what the results are and whether the right things are being done or not in other venues. So there's a monitoring and coordination effort that's required. It's not obvious to me that there's a need for a whole separate interoperability or development effort of any kind out of EAC to deal with things that are being considered elsewhere. The I3 document is in version 2 right now, and a number of the issues that came out of the ICE event that had to do with interoperability relative to accessibility and so on have been taken into account there. I'm not sure they all have been. There's probably some small number that may have been forced to be put on the list for version 3. There will be a version 3 of I3. So I think it's pretty much a coordination and communication effort more than it is a separate work effort that needs to take place.
This is Christian again. I have a follow-up. I want to clarify that our committee is looking at the I3 standards and not in terms of interoperability.
Yes, I understand
but
that.
More in terms of the CISRIC working group.
Right. I was talking more to the interoperability piece that Mark Fletcher is referring to.
This is Christian again. So are there some people who are already looking at the EAAC recommendations to ensure that the I3 standards are in support of our recommendations? I think they still need to look at the work that we've done and the recommendations that we've made to make sure that everything that we need is included. Do you know if that's happening?
This is Roger Hickson. I don't know offhand without checking, but it's literally happening, but there's no reason why it can't, and it should be, obviously.
Well, I would say that it's important for the EAC to get its recommendations out so that that process can begin in some cases.
That's true, too.
This is Richard. I think Bob has a comment.
This is Bob. And I wanted to let you know that Mr. McFarland and I are we still have things left over from our committee. And so we feel that we are not really qualified to address those issues, particularly on the user's requirements and the functionality requirements for NG 911. I think that Chapter 3 or something like that needs to be reviewed and cleaned up. So I suggest that this committee not continue that, but to perhaps get that out to the committee, perhaps for a review of all the reports and the comments.
This is Richard, and I think Donna Platt has a comment. Go ahead, Donna. This is Donna. I wanted to comment about what Bob has said. His subcommittee has made a report and recommendations that I've looked through, and they were written last year. And I'm thinking that my subcommittee on the PSAP video and other communication accessibility, there's some terminology that needs to be updated so that it's more clear. I think it's too easy if we leave it as is for misunderstandings to happen. So there's some information in that report that needs to be updated. And I think our subcommittee could maybe help in expanding on or clarifying some of those terms. I'm afraid if it's approved as is, that there will be information that is more recent that's not included in that report. And I know that we have other subcommittees who are already working on their edits. I don't know if we would have the time to make those final edits to the report, or if there's an easy way to pull from other reports that are already updated and more recent with the terminology.
This is Bob here. In order to follow up with you, and Donna, with what you said, I agree with you, that your report that we had discussed today should replace Chapter 3, I believe, and that yours was more accurate and up to date, instead of redoing the old Chapter 3.
This is Richard. Thank you for that discussion. So we'll take a look at this and see how we can rearrange this offline and distribute that to the full committee for their consideration. It's very helpful for us to get an understanding of what's expected among the group. Now I'd like to move on to our next topic, which has to do with our meeting schedules. Would you like to meet monthly? Would we like to meet monthly in person? Would we like to do teleconferences? What do we want our future meetings to look like? What's your pleasure, as it were? So let's try to give me an idea of what we're looking at. Should we meet again next month? I guess is the first question. And how do we want to meet, whether we want to continue with the EAC meetings here at the FCC or through another means. Matthew?
Matt Gersa, CTIA. So I don't have any comment on the particular frequency of meetings or whether and how we should do them by conference call or in person. I think it makes sense to consider the reports and the presentations that we have today, and then make that determination. Because we may find that we have sufficient agreement on a substantial number of these reports, and maybe we don't need to make a decision about whether we need to meet next month or not right now. So that would be my proposals. Why don't we see what we have on the table today and then make that decision later in the meeting. Thank you.
This is Richard. Matt, thank you. I think I will take your suggestion, and we will table that question until the end of our meeting after we've gone through all three of our presentations on the agenda today. Everyone in agreement? With that, I think that would be a good time for us to kick off with, this is subcommittee number 1, which is recommendations on text messaging to 911, which is Brian Daly and Greg Vanderheiden. Okay. Do we have Brian?
Yes, this is Brian Daly on the phone. I will be giving the presentation from subcommittee number 1. Can we bring the presentation?
Just one second. I'm bringing it up here.
Thank you. There is a delay in the video feed, so please let me know when to proceed.
Sure. Matt?
Thanks. So Matt Gerst, CTA. One question I did have before we even get to these reports, what's the process we're using for reviewing them? Are we just considering the presentations from the co-chairs and taking comments, or are we looking to seek consensus today? I mean, with the additional time, it sounds like what we should be doing is considering the presentations, if there are any comments, considering those, and then not looking to sort of finalize these. So these would be essentially drafts at the end of today's meetings, all these reports. Is that correct?
Chris?
This is Chris. I like that idea where we're looking at the presentations and considering them after we complete the discussions and answer any questions. We certainly, coming in today, did not have any idea if or how long we would be extended for recharter. So I can only speak for our subcommittee, but we are very happy to have more time to improve things, but when I arrived here this morning, we were prepared to say, okay, this is what we would like to submit, so we would like everybody to review it, and if we're all in agreement or we can come to a consensus at least, we would like to move forward and approve it for recommendation to the full committee. So I think that's what Matt is suggesting for all the groups.
This is Brian.
Brian?
Yes, from subcommittee number 1 perspective, I think that's in line with our expectations from today. We have a fairly large report as well, which we are going to present as a draft document out of the subcommittee to the full EAAC. I believe the full EAAC will need time to review the document, and I would suggest, given the extension, that the anticipation was the report will be a draft report, and we can continue soliciting feedback from the full AAC as we now have the extension. Thank you.
This is Richard here. So in other words, we will not be voting on those 3 recommendations today for the whole committee. Is that correct? Okay. Seeing no objections, thank you. Think that we're good. Okay, then I would say, Brian, I have your PowerPoint presentation pulled up on my screen right now. This is Christian. Sorry to interrupt. I think I missed something important. Can we agree, or have we agreed to set up a deadline for feedback? I think that our subcommittee discussed the possibility of asking the full EAC to provide feedback within 1 month from today's meeting. This is Richard. If that is what your subcommittee wants, this is Christian. Yes, but no one has formally requested that yet. So, but we would. Yes.
This is Joel. Joel Zeff.
Joel, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been raising my hand, but I don't think we're using the queue, and I apologize. I think that's a proper idea. I believe we have bought some time. We can all have an opportunity of reviewing the entire reports, plural. We're all working on individual ones, but use the next meeting as a formal adoption or to be able to vote and accept the reports at that point. But I think a month is fine, and then whenever the next meeting is, we give that as a presentation of the final reports.
This is Richard. Okay, so it looks like everyone in the room is in agreement that, first off, we do not need to vote on these presentations or reports, that we will have time to review and make recommendations individually as members of the full committee and have that feedback incorporated. So I think that we are good. So now we will be moving on to our presentation by Brian Daly and Greg Vanderheiden. And I have the PowerPoint presentation up on the laptop ready to show.
This is Brian Daly. Thank you. And I'll start with the presentation material. I still don't see it on the video feed, but I assume it's on the screen. So the first title screen is just, thank you. This is the Interim Text to 911 Working Group Report with co-chairs myself, Brian Daly from AT&T, and Greg Vanderheiden representing Trace. Let's move to the next slide, please. Just as a refresher on what the subcommittee was tasked to do, we were charged with developing recommendation and draft language for the full committee with regard to pre-NG911 mobile text to 911 solutions. And there are various provisions from the EAAC recommendations that relate to our work. Again, I won't go through what those provisions are, but that just set the scope and bounds for what we were tasked to do. Next slide, please. As far as the work group progress, we've held a number of calls and have had excellent participation from subcommittee members, and I want to acknowledge that participation and contribution from the members because it certainly led to the completion of this report for where we are today. We did focus on 4 areas: the user and originating devices, the originating networks, the transport networks, and the PSAP end. And what we are delivering today is a draft consensus report that was completed by the working group. And this report is a consensus report from the working group and is being submitted to the EAAC as a draft report for consideration. Next slide, please. A summary of what we have in this draft report, we did recognize that the ability to text to 911 is key to ensure that 911 remains accessible to people with disabilities who are unable to make a voice call to 911 and to address situations where making a voice call is not possible. And we did consider questions around the user needs and constraints for text to 911 and the role of originating networks and devices, the characteristics of the transport networks between the originating networks and the 911 PSAPs, and the PSAP administrative and operational considerations. Next slide, please. Based on a detailed investigation of these questions, the working group developed a set of recommendations for accessible text to 911 in the following areas. We came up with a set of general recommendations for text to 911. We recognized the features of SMS-based text to 911. We looked at some policy considerations for near-term text to 911 service, public education, and we identified some future considerations and next steps that need to be taken. Next slide. It is important to note that adoption and application of these recommendations will need to be determined through the appropriate rulemaking and standards development process. And some of the recommendations may require research and development of technical standards, best practices, and guidelines before they can be applied. And we especially note that public expectations, including individuals with disabilities, for 911 emergency communications should be taken into consideration where further research and development may be necessary. Next slide, please. The draft working group report has a number of sections, and I'll just highlight the table of contents here. We have an executive summary, an overview section, the user needs and constraints section, which includes a user experience subsection, originating devices and network, transport networks, including the text control complex as being defined within the joint ATIS-TIA standards. Next slide. The PSAP end, the National Interim Text and Vendor Proprietary Solutions, Education and Outreach, recommendations. Next slide. And then we have a number of appendices that are included in the report. Now, if we switch to the next slide titled General Recommendations, it's not my intent to go through each one of these in detail today. I just wanted to highlight that there are a number of recommendations that we have included within the report, and since the EAAC has been given the extension, I will leave it to each of the EAAC members to have the time to go through the report and look at the recommendations and consider the recommendations, and we can discuss further detail at the next meeting if there are any questions. So the next several slides do include a summary of those recommendations, and again, my intent would not be to go through them here today, but just to point out that there are, Section 8 of the document does contain all the recommendations that we've got within the subcommittee. If I can have you move to the slide titled Next Steps at this point. So as mentioned, working group draft report is delivered to the full EAAC today. And as we came into this meeting, the next steps were dependent upon the future of the EAAC. We are asking for the full EAAC to report and comment on the working group draft report, and also the subcommittee will meet next week and address future consideration section of the draft report as well. Final slide is just a big thank you to the members and invited experts for their contributions to the report and working to further the spirit of collaboration and purpose that has sustained the EAAC. I'd also like to put a special thank you to Dwayne Sennett of AT&T, who assisted in the editing of the document and helped us pull together all the material into a format that we are delivering today. So, Richard, let me turn it back to you. That concludes the presentation at this point today, and I'll open it, turn it back to you to open and answer any questions. Thank you.
This is Greg.
Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, just one comment. Our subcommittee, as co-chair, just a comment. Our subcommittee hasn't, formally done formal adoption vote, etc. But we wanted to move this out to the full committee as we are getting toward our closing steps in order to be able to get input from the whole committee, so that as we are finalizing our document and our recommendations and everything else, that we had all of the input from everybody and not just from those of the committee and the subcommittee itself. So this is an opportunity to see a draft of the document rather than a formal release of the document in order to get full input committee to the process. So it's still ongoing, so please feel free to comment. Thank you.
This is Richard. Looks like Jean-Paul. I have two other people in the queue after you, but first we'll turn it over to Jean-Paul for your question. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Richard. I want to make sure that Greg's comment is not misunderstood. The committee, Subcommittee 1, as far as I am aware, had a consensus approval of this document, and it was being brought forward to the EAC with Subcommittee 1's approval of the document. So now what we are looking for is feedback, as Brian has mentioned, so that we can go ahead and make whatever revisions are necessary to that report. But there was a full consensus of the parties that were involved in drafting this document.
This is Brian, if I may expand on that.
Yes, Brian, please go ahead.
Yes, JP is right. The subcommittee is just that, a subcommittee with really no voting rights or so forth within the EAC, was my understanding. So what we did was take a consensus, ask for consensus for moving this document forward to the full EAC for consideration. So I think JP properly characterized it as we did have a consensus view out of the subcommittee for presentation of this report today. Thank you.
This is Richard. Great, thank you. And I have Sherry in the queue here as well. Sherry? Yes, this is Sherry. So the EAC can accept that document with the understanding that the next step is to include a more developed timeline in different sections there, along with major milestones. And secondly, we also need to make sure that the US DOJ is going to put pressure on the PSAPs to make sure that they are on board with everything that's included in this report as well, in terms of accepting text messages to 911 and our recommendations outlined in this report. So I submit then that to the EAC, that we follow that recommendation and ask for consensus on that and accepting that report with those considerations. This is Richard. Brian, did you want to make any comment on that?
This is Brian. We do have, under future considerations, a discussion of that topic. And I think I've already scheduled a meeting for next week, given the extension of the EAC, to begin discussions on that. But I think Sherry's comment will certainly be taken within the subcommittee, and we'll address how to best incorporate her issues.
This is Richard. Okay, thank you. The next person in the queue is Bernard Abobo.
Sorry, I was in queue from something before. I'll take my name off.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Bernard. I was trying to follow our list. So, and now Christian, please.
Greg.
This is Christian speaking. There's obviously... Oh, I'm sorry, I'll wait for the camera. I'll repeat myself. Again, this is Christian speaking. There's been a lot of work that has gone into this, a lot of effort that has gone into Subcommittee Number 1's report, and I really want to extend my sincere thanks to everyone for everything that they have done. I want to point out also some specific people in the subcommittee who have really... they have sacrificed their winter break or winter vacation so they can continue this work to get it finished by this meeting, and I just really appreciate all those folks who have done that. I'd also like to emphasize that in this work we have strongly focused on solving issues rather than getting into the weeds on things. We're trying to take a look at these issues from a multitude of different perspectives, and I really appreciate that about Subcommittee Number 1. This is Richard Ray. Matt Gerst.
Greg raising his hand also.
Okay, thank you. Matt?
Here we go. Matt Gerst, the CTIA. So Christian stole my thunder. Thank you very much, Christian. I also wanted to echo everything that Christian just said. I think we had some great collaboration and work, and I especially want to thank Roger Hickson and Christian Vogler. The three of us worked very hard, as Christian said, over the winter break at points to bring a lot of the content together, and I think we made a lot of progress. So thank you to everyone who worked on this report. I think job well done.
This is Richard. Excellent. Greg Vanderheiden.
Yes. So sorry if my comments were misunderstood. What I was trying to do was to say that we did vote consensus to bring this to the full committee. My comment was only meant to say that our committee work wasn't finished until we got the feedback from the full committee, and it was meant to be an invitation to people to feel free to comment, etc., so that we can get the reported to the final form. Finally, it's been an amazing group of people, and the spirit of people trying to work together to try and find common ground, etc. And again, as co-chair, I wanted to thank everybody that's been working so hard on this, and the same group of characters, so Roger, etc., and Brian for all the work. As chair, it's expected of him, but it's an awful lot of work, and he's really done a lot of work to try and make this all come together. So,
kudos to your group. A round of applause for them in the room here. Excellent. Okay. Are there any further questions that we have for Greg and Brian before we move on to our next report from the Media Communications Line Services group? Any last questions? Seeing none, I want to thank Brian and Greg for an outstanding presentation. I really appreciate your report. Thank you so much. And now let's turn it over to Chris Littlewood and Donna Platt. So take it away, Chris.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me first start by saying how we're going to run through this presentation. We have a short PowerPoint presentation as well. We'll be putting that up in just a second, or go ahead if you want to put up the introductory slide now, if you will. First, I'll reiterate a lot of the comments that were said in the first subcommittee, and that is to extend a huge amount of thanks to a lot of the people that gave up so much of their winter break or holiday time to continue to work on this document to bring it here before you today. My biggest amount of appreciation and kudos goes to my co-chair, Donna Platt, who is on the phone bridge but put in a huge amount of work and countless hours with Richard's support and many, many other people that have given comments, including Gunnar, Christian, Matt, Sonny, Sherry, Tony, Bernard, and forgive me if I'm forgetting anybody else. I know many people have shared a lot of information, and we truly, truly appreciate that. As I begin, I will say that we do continue here with a bit of a sigh of relief in the fact that we have been given a brief extension in our meeting, so to speak, as a full committee. As John Paul pointed out before, the subcommittee is handing before a proposal or a draft document with the consensus of the subcommittee. But with no voting powers within the subcommittee, we are now releasing it to the full committee to give full feedback and comment with the 1-month deadline that I am very much in favor of. so that we can set up additional timelines and stuff so we don't run into a crunch like we just had before this next 6 months runs out. So with that, if you would take a quick look at the PowerPoint slide presentation, and we'll talk a little bit about the draft, so to speak. I will make comments on each slide, and then after I make comments, I'll let Donna add anything that she wants to add, and then we will move on to the next slide. After we complete the dozen or so slides, any questions that anybody may have, we'll move on to that. The introductory slide says NG 911 services, media communication line services. As you will recall, this has been the evolution from the former name, which was the Emergency Video Sign Language and Communication Services. More alphabet soup, so to speak, but we are trying to include everybody, and that's what it is about. And so with that, media communications seems to be more appropriate in doing that for including all methods. Everything that we're going to be talking about is based on direct connect to 911 when we get to the step of next generation 911. We're talking about NG 911 and any phase-in stuff or things like that. That will be something that we definitely will need to talk about. But this is all the proposal for how things should work once NG 911 is established. And that is for direct connect to the PSAP. For people using any form of media communication, whether that be video, text, or voice calls. Donna, is there anything you wanted to add to that, or if we can go ahead and move to the next slide?
Yes, I would like to add something. This is Donna, and I'll keep my comments brief now. For the institution of NG 911 and the ability to include different communication modalities, that is the purpose of NG 911, to include a wide array of, whether that be video, voice, text, any type of text, any type of media would be inclusive in the NG 911 rollout. And those calls could come from anyone, regardless of their hearing status or hearing loss. And we would use that system to meet our needs, and it's not dependent upon the type of media we would be using.
Okay, second slide, please. Thank you, Donna.
Could we have the PowerPoint back on the screen, please? Thank you.
Okay, as Donna just said or summarized, NG 911 is already prepared or discussed the idea of receiving calls from the different methods of communication, including video calls. MCLS, Media Communication Line Services, will provide multi-conference communication services after direct connect to the PSAP in the same manner as voice language services for languages other than English. And that's already happening today. Next slide, please. Okay, and these are the recommendations of the MCLS proposal. You can read them here. I won't read them all word for word to you, but they include independent MCLS centers, both recognized and certified nationally, standard SOP, standard qualifications for both sign language interpreters and communications assistants in handling 911 calls. So not just in handling ASL calls or interpreting calls, but in handling calls in an emergency situation. And also standard training for emergency situations for both sign language interpreters and communications assistants. In the full document, which has been available, Susie was kind enough to make copies of the full document for everybody, but you can see the MCLS services recommended standards are set up in sections 8, 9, and 10 in the full document, and you can review that and make comments as necessary. Next slide, please. Okay, continuing recommendations, standard employee assistance programs for sign language interpreters and communications assistants. This is in regard to,
Chris, if I could
stress
interject.
Or related to handling emergency calls. And, okay. I think Donna was going to jump in and say what I just said, but this is related to stress and emergency calls, and that's what the employee assistance program is related to. Also, the MCLS will be required for standard quality assurance by independent group of people to evaluate the interpreters and the communications assistant to make sure that the proper services are provided in emergency situations. Additionally, in the recommendations is consumer outreach and education programs so that the public that may be using MCLS are aware how it's going to be working and what they can do to improve and protect themselves, and put some of the responsibility on the individual and not just those providing the services. The recommendations also include interoperability requirements between the technical standards between MCLS and the PSAPs. One thing to point out is that this is already happening within language services, where there are some language services that are already able to provide video communication and translation or interpretation, and all that needs to happen is the standards set up between the language services and the PSAPs themselves. And finally, standard policy and operating protocol on contingency plans for MCLS. And that basically comes down to having more than one MCLS center, so that if one has to go offline for whatever reason, or somebody becomes unavailable, that somebody else is able to pick up and run with the ball and make sure that the service is provided to the individual in the most critical situation, being an emergency. Okay, I'll let Donna add anything that she wants to with the recommendations, and then we'll follow up with the next slide.
I'm all set. I think you covered it. Thank you for that.
Okay. That said, the recommendations follow with the need for functional equivalency and why we want to be able to do this. Well, first, and very importantly, is the full committee's 2011 survey review, which states both that the people that responded to that survey said that the devices that they use every day, and that it was also very important to have direct connect to 911 and the PSAPs, and not to VRS first. So those are the two things that people answering the survey that we sent out in 2011 said, and that's what we're trying to do here. So it's just basically setting things up to where it absolutely does not want to eliminate communication services, just change the way things are done in the fact that people are able to contact the PSAPs directly first. The second thing, of course, is functional equivalency in itself, in that people with disabilities access to the same services as hearing callers and non-English speaking callers that have been calling legacy 911 or PSAPs directly for years. And the fact that if I speak Spanish or Vietnamese or any other language, I can pick up the phone and make a voice call to 911 right now. It's immediately connected to the PSAP, and then if the telecommunicator assesses that the person speaks a language other than English, then they connect to language services, and that translation is provided. So all that we're asking is for the same thing. Finally, there is a lack of standards that exist in regulation from the FCC or otherwise for 911 relay calls to be connected to the appropriate PSAP. This is in regard to the amount of time that it takes, or how safe it is, and ways to make sure that those standards are set up, or why we need to do this. Donna, is there anything else you wanted to add before we move on to the next slide?
Yes, I would like to add something. This is Donna speaking. In regards to the final comment about the lack of standards, the problem that we've seen is that for priority calls that are going into 911, they're being answered quicker. But there is a delay in the time that it takes to connect to the PSAP as well. The process itself requires time to connect to the router service company, and the 911 calls tend to go through a different line. Separate, the 911 calls go through a different line separate from the 911 line.
The operators have a list of priority in terms of which calls they answer more quickly, and they have to more quickly answer the 911 calls. Those take priority over the non-911 incoming calls or the non-emergency calls. Those can be pushed into a queue. So many times, the calls coming through those the 911 calls end up routed through those non-911 channels, so they're harder to recognize. We want those emergency calls to go directly to the PSAP, to not get caught up in that process where they have to be filtered and routed, and that causes a delay.
Right, thank you, Donna. That's absolutely correct. Also, with the routing services, there is no immediate connection to automatic number identification and automatic location identification. And the routing services may provide service direct to a PSAP and emergency services, or they may provide information to an administrative line to a PSAP and not a 911 communication center. So that's a great deal of concern. That's how things are acting now, and that's what we want to change with the consensus of this MCLS document. Go ahead and bring up the next slide with the first diagram. We felt that even the most basic pictures say 1,000 words, so to speak, and this is just basically how things are now, where if somebody is calling 911 or to a PSAP using voice or a TTY call, it's a direct connection between a caller and the PSAP. This is very important that you have that direct connection because in a 911 or emergency situation, that's where seconds count. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the same situation where a hearing person calls speaking a language other than English. It's a direct connect call between the caller and the PSAP and 911, and then the PSAP determines that the person is speaking a language other than English, and it makes a direct connect to language services and helps make the translation or interpretation between the other language for the telecommunicator and the PSAP and the caller to bridge that gap in an immediate manner. Next slide, please. Okay, what I was leading to before with the questions about no ANI, ALI for the routing services for automatic number identification or location identification. Basically, something else to point out with the way things are now with VRS or routing services is dispatchers are not instinctively trained through VRS or routing services to get the location no matter where a person is. If you are in a PSAP or a 911 center, that is absolutely true. When I was a dispatcher, no matter what pops up on your screen and says where the person is calling from, you still say, where are you? So no matter what GPS is able to provide with NG 911 or things like that, that's something that's trained from a dispatcher standpoint to help determine the location of the person that needs help. And with VRS or routing services, those people are not specifically trained to help identify the location or verify a number of where a person may be. Those questions are specifically trained for somebody that is answering a call for emergencies every day. That's something that came up at the end of the year last year. Somebody said that if somebody is providing communication services or interpreting services, anybody could provide the emergency type calls. And that is specifically where I definitely disagree. That somebody needs to be trained in an emergency type situation for the reason that I just mentioned for location, because in an emergency situation, once again, seconds count. Seconds count. And that person that provides communication assistance as an interpreter or in any of the other manners for media communications, for things like a doctor's appointment or any of the other myriad reasons why you may call to use VRS or a video interpreter, where that person is calling from may not be of critical importance. But it absolutely is in an emergency situation, and that is probably the biggest reason why it is important for a direct connect situation to occur in every case for direct connect from the caller to the PSAP. Donna, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, this is Donna, and I would like to add to Chris's remarks that he just made. Many of us are required to register our preferred relay service with our preferred relay service provider. So if we were to call 911, they would already have our information registered within their own database that would then be connected. So when we have 911 on the line, they can already see the caller information on their screen. That's both the ANI and the ALI. But if we perhaps are not at that address, if we're calling from a remote location somewhere different than home, they would have to ask us to verify the address where we are, and sometimes that does not happen. If I am calling through a different line, not to 911, you would not see my ANI or ALI. That information would not appear. So I think it's important that the telecommunication priority, that we ask the caller for their location. At times there will be, the appropriate information will be there at the PSAP, and other times it will not. And then there are times where the PSAP will then be able to transfer us to the proper location. And if that doesn't happen, it would mean that I would have to call again. So the direct connect would ensure that we are connected to the appropriate PSAP.
Thank you, Donna, for making my next two most important points. If somebody else is using a communication device or the registry information is not correct, that is absolutely why someone needs to be trained at a higher standard, so to speak, for emergency call type situations. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the very basic slide for how things will be with NG 911, and this is not necessarily for a person with disability needing to call a PSAP, but anyone. NG 911 will be able to accept video, text, voice, or data in a call. That is already being the case. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just very simply a diagram that adds media communication line services, where the direct communication goes from the caller to the PSAP, and then the PSAP determines that the person is unable to hear or uses a different form of communication, being sign language, or requires assistance, and the PSAP, just like if someone speaks another language, connects to media communication line services. Next slide, please. And finally, this additional piece of the diagram that's added here, which is the 911 caller profile, that will be in relation to outreach to the public about what will happen with NG 911 and the available communication through MCLS, and a person will have the ability to provide profile information and communication preferences. So the way I often think of this is, if this was available today, I would run, not walk, and make sure that someone knew that I could use the assistance of a sign language interpreter and captioning, and I would make sure that that came up in the 911 caller profile, so that even though I use my voice and speak very well, that if I connected on video to a PSAP, they would right away know to connect to media communication line services. And I wouldn't have to explain that I'm deaf or that I'm late deaf, that it would just automatically be, they see on the profile, okay, I need to connect to MCLS on this call, and boom, they hit a button and it's immediately made a connection in that case. So the entire concept of this whole paper for media communication line services is direct to connect in every case for the caller to the PSAP, for people with disabilities, no matter what the situation is, and it will work in the exact same manner as language services does in Legacy 911. Again, the paper that is before you, we did not know how we were moving forward when we started this meeting this morning. This is a draft that's ready to be accepted for your approval. We certainly look forward to any feedback. One thing Donna and I have already talked about is sharing with other consumers and other organizations outside this group for any feedback within the 1 month period of time that we've already talked about. We will move forward and conduct additional meetings and create a timeline from there so we can come to a conclusion and hopefully get a full consensus from everybody here on the committee. So thank you very much.
Donna, is there anything you'd like to add? And Donna's saying, I welcome any feedback from the group. It would be wonderful and very much appreciated. For anyone outside of our committee and everyone who worked on what we've done, thank you so much. This is Richard. I have 3 people in our queue ready to ask questions or comments. The first is Bernard Aboga.
Yeah. I would recommend that this document be sent to the SIP Forum VRS because it could represent a set of requirements or asks that they would work on.
Bernard, thank you. That is absolutely already on our list for people that we need to contact and share this document with. We welcome their feedback, and again, it is a paradigm shift, and we absolutely do not want to eliminate sign language interpreters from providing video relay services just in the fact that we want direct connect to the PSAP and then bringing in video relay services in a different manner or format and setting up standards at that point. So as I think I mentioned several months ago, bringing in interpreters or people that work in the VRS or business, we definitely need to get their feedback, and that's something that we will be working on. Thank you, Bernard.
Gunnar, and then we'll move on to Sherry. So now.
Okay, thank you. Didn't I slip in front of a lot of people in the queue? But thank you anyway. I grabbed the chance. First, yes, for the VRS activity in SIP Forum, you can hand over the material to me because I'm one of the co-chairs in that activity. So that's next thing I will grab to work on when I get my things done here. And yes, I agree very much that it's very tightly interlinked and very good requirements that you can bring from that group into the VRS standardization activity in SIP Forum. There are 2 things. I tried very late to put in an aspect that did not get time to get into this document, and that was the sizing, the manning and staffing of this service, this extra service. I evaluated it, and with my just assumptions of load, I found that about 4 interpreters on duty at the same time for the sign language side of this service would be sufficient for all of USA. That if you shall try to staff a service with very good short response time with this little use, then it will be very expensive with the interpreters sitting doing nothing, just waiting to be rapidly on a call. So I think this aspect should be looked at and brought in and see how this use of experienced 911 sign language interpreters can share the work, sit there doing other work, but being very much prepared to jump in and take the 911 calls, and thereby both having more pleasant working situation and also being better utilized. So that's one thing. How shall we bring that aspect in? Shall we use the extra month to also have a chapter of staffing and manning and sizing, or shall we just request that topic to be brought up by the FCC? The other thing is that the last picture is very important, the profile, the chance to have a preview of what capabilities, what preferences the user has when the call comes to the PSAP is essential, especially for speech-disabled people, to sit there with a speech-disabled person and a PSAP and trying to explain that I am speech-disabled and need my speech language assistance. It must be frustrating. So profiles or other ways to get your usual everyday service included, or everyday type of service included in the calls, is very important. So, 2 questions.
Joel Zoe.
Chris would like to reply briefly to that comment, and then we'll move on down our list.
Okay, thank you, Gunnar. I've heard some very important points that you brought up, and I'd like to respond to them. First, with regard to the size of staff that will be required for MCLS, one of the things that I've been looking into for the past several months is the number of calls that are handled by VRS or TRS that are for emergency services. Unfortunately, like I think that we've discussed before, there aren't a lot of statistics in this manner. So there aren't a lot of hard numbers. That is something with NG 911 and MCLS. We can get more information in the interim from language services. When you mention frustration for somebody that is speech disabled and speaking to the PSAP and trying to get them to understand that they need some type of additional assistance, the frustration would hopefully be less if the telecommunicator at the PSAP could see the person, and just like if they spoke a language other than English, if they saw that the person was speech disabled, then the telecommunicator would be able to, in a matter of a couple of seconds, connect and provide multi-conferencing from MCLS. So we still do have to add some of the things that you talked about related to staffing. That is probably in gathering statistics that may already exist from language services and stuff related to other languages. So that may be helpful in getting that information together. But I don't think it will be a huge staffing number when it's strictly related to emergency calls. Donna, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I did, actually. Okay, Gunnar, I understand your comments, but if it's our responsibility to decide how MCLS is established, the number of staff that are required, et cetera, I think that's really more of a policy decision in terms of the number of staff and how the staffing is provided. So I don't know whether that's left to the FCC or the DOJ, but I think that we should really manage the scope of what we're recommending. We are simply recommending that it happen through an MCLS service. Chris is right, there are no statistics or hard numbers in terms of the number of emergency calls that are received through the relay service at this point. I think the beginning of the beginning of 2012, we looked at 8 or 9 months worth of data, and it said that there were 8.9 million minutes of calls placed through the VRS service nationwide. But there was no information at all about how many of those minutes were emergency calls or calls to 911. It's not a requirement of the FCC that VRS providers document those emergency calls. So remember, using video conferencing for communication is new for many people with disabilities. It's just starting in terms of people with speech disabilities, for them to have speech-to-speech services or to be able to use video services to enhance communication. If people with speech disabilities knew that this service was available to them, that there were a new program, I think many of them would be very eager to use it, and we would probably see an increase then in the number of people who are using it and the need to staff a center at a greater rate. In terms of setting up MCLS, we're not asking for an extensive number of centers, but just a few spread out geographically. So we're not asking for a multitude of centers, but for VRS providers, I think we have about 125 call centers throughout the country, and that's tremendous compared to what we're asking for, which is maybe 3 centers to begin with, and see how that goes. Of 125 general call centers, I would say there are probably 5,000 interpreters or CAs. I don't know that many, if any, are trained in emergency calls. They are required to accept those kinds of 911 calls, although many would prefer not to. So those service providers have no standards by which they need to adhere. There's no policy on the type of training that needs to be provided. So we really see a great variety in the ability of providers to accept those kinds of calls efficiently. So we're looking for the establishment of centers, trainings, and call takers who are interested in handling those kinds of calls. And so I think that that's specifically what we're asking for. But I don't know that it's within the scope of what we're doing to set policy or even necessarily the technical standards, the financial resources. I think for me it's more about making these recommendations and then leaving that open to the next steps as we progress toward NG 911. So what we would like to see happen in the near term is what's in our report, and I think the specifics would come as we progress. Next in the queue is Sherry. This is Sherry, thank you. Just making sure that we've got a clear video connection. First of all, I would like to thank Donna and Chris for all of their blood, sweat, and tears over this report and chasing down a deadline for this meeting and getting it completed. Richard, for you as well. I know that you put in a tremendous amount of work. And I know it was a very difficult report, a difficult issue to tackle. I do want to clarify some things that were said during the report. First of all, I don't want to beat up VRS too much. I know we said that we started out not having the standard, so they're not expected to meet a particular standard. VRS operators are not mandated to ask. They don't have a responsibility to ask the location information that we talked about. PSAPs are very different. They don't operate under the same rules at all. So maybe that's something that can be modified in the rules. PSAPs, like we said, are the operators, it's their first priority to find out where a caller is calling from. That is not something that has been required of VRS to exchange that kind of information. They're facilitating communication. They don't actually have agency to ask where someone is. in terms of the report, I also want to emphasize that aspect of direct connect. It's the same with text to 911. We're asking that folks are able to text directly to the PSAP, and in this case, that direct connect would provide us with functional equivalency. So I would appreciate seeing that statement clear in the report that it is a matter of functional equivalency. I don't think that the report talked about or talked clearly about what we've mentioned before in terms of split screen access. So if someone calls 911, that they're able to see the 911 call taker as well as the communication assistant, whether it be the interpreter or whoever is assisting from the MCLS. And I don't think the sections talk about that specifically. And there may be people out there who read the report who don't know exactly what we mean when we talk about having access to both parties, so maybe expanding that would be helpful. I wanted to follow up on Donna's question about the work that we're doing and who is going to basically, who we're going to pass the baton to, so who would make the policy decisions and so forth. And I just want to emphasize that, this comes up over and over again, and I think the Department of Justice has to put pressure on the PSAPs. And I know that we have representatives here at the table, but I think that they need to be involved to make sure there's acceptance at every step of the way with our recommendations, so that they're ready and willing to make this transition and participate, and that they don't get this dumped on them at the last minute and have to respond to policy issues and design issues that have been already created without their input or without any contact with them. Can the EAAC recommend that the FCC move forward with requirements to the SIP forum for VRS? So there's a key point that I think Richard Ray brought up. That's its response time is critical. So I wonder, can the EAC make that recommendation? This is Richard. I see Donna has her hand up. Donna? This is Donna. I'd like to respond to the last part of Sherry's comments. I don't know if the EAC can make a recommendation regarding some of the VRS issues that we've identified. But just to let you know that under the NENA, the National Emergency Numbering Association standards, the work that's been done, Richard and myself are involved. They have some accessibility guidelines. There's a committee working on accessibility guidelines, and there's a document that's in progress called VRS IP Relay PSAP Interaction and Operations Information Document. So there are a list of potential issues that need to be addressed and recommendations. And those are currently in the works, so I think we could certainly send it to them for their feedback. They're nearly finished with that report. Once it's completed through NENA, then that will be shared with the FCC for their consideration. So maybe that's something that that we can add there, or the EAC can even recommend. I'm open to suggestions about how that information is passed forward. This is Richard. Thank you, Donna. I think Chris wanted to respond, and then after Chris, I have Mark in the queue. Chris, go ahead.
This is Chris again. Thank you very much, Shari. And I just wanted to basically say that I agree with you in the fact that this report is not meant to beat up on VRS in any way. However, the VRS not being required to determine the location of the caller is exactly why there needs to be a separation of standards or a separate way of doing things if the caller is calling in an emergency situation. Like Donna just said, Nina is addressing this in a section related to VRS and such, but that's why an emergency call needs to be handled in a different manner so that the location of the caller can be determined as well.
And Mark Fletcher, you were next.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Mark Fletcher with Avaya. A couple of points. When we're talking about direct connect to a 911 PSAP, I want to make sure that everyone understands that we're not talking about an individual calling a specific endpoint on the network. We're talking about having them dialing or calling 911 directly instead of an alternative agency and then being sent there. Not only is this important for all the reasons that Christopher mentioned, it also is important to take advantage of the resilient design of the 911 network itself. If a particular PSAP is not functioning or is overloaded, the network in itself will reroute that call to a secondary. So it's important that we don't have this direct point-to-point communication. And by by direct connect, we mean direct connect to 911 and not a specific 911 endpoint. I think that's an important clarification to make. And also, just to back up something that Sherry touched on, is that today, through a relay service, typically the 911 telecommunicator, the dispatcher, cannot see or hear the 911 caller. And there is significant background audio that's relevant or background video that might be relevant. And again, I think those are all important and relevant points that should be included in this. So those are my comments. Excellent job. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And I think Joel also wanted to make some comments on the bridge. And once
Yes.
Joel is finished, then Christian is up. Joel, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Joel here. The model seems to require that the PSAP operator, whoever a person is, be able to determine what form of language, be foreign language or other, or make a determination if the person who's not answering the phone may need sign language, ASL, or any other form of sign language. But there's a lot of decisions being made here, and any training that takes place would age quickly because there's not a lot of volume of these type of calls to keep skills honed and what have you. I thought one of our goals was to also provide people who are deaf to use the same communication methods they use for everyday communication. So that be it if they do use 711 relay or video relay or VCO services or even their voice, any method they're comfortable with to make the call as an alternative to just dialing 911 and not knowing what would happen because they don't do that every day. So I thought we had one of our goals was to also provide an opportunity to use what people are comfortable with for their everyday communication. I know I follow a lot of deaf-blind communication on the web, and I'm absolutely amazed by the quality of communication people are using among themselves with their specialized equipment and braille readers, and they can actually call anybody at any time through that kind of system. I would not have to force them into another system. This is my comments. Go ahead.
Thank you, Joel. Christian? This is Christian, does anybody want to respond to some of the previous comments before I move forward?
Yeah, this is Greg.
Yes, Greg?
Yeah, I think in response to the last comment, when we talk about that people should be able to call directly without going through a relay, sometimes people think that means that people should never go through a relay. And I think that it's important to say that the requirement isn't that no calls would go through a relay. It's that because if somebody, as pointed out earlier, usually uses the relay and that's what they're most comfortable using, well, the only thing they think of in an emergency, then in fact we will still get calls through the relay, and we shouldn't not accept them. The goal, however, was to make it so that you didn't have to go through a relay in order to talk to 911. And I think that that's an important distinction to make or thing to remind us. We're not saying that it shouldn't be possible. We're saying that you shouldn't have to. If people want to call directly, they should be able to and engage the relay in a partnership. I think the other part that we would like to get to is eventually that even if you do call the relay and then the relay connects to 911, it would be best if that was the same kind of an arrangement where as soon as you connect to 911, all three parties are on the call so that the relay operator can see the person who's calling directly. And I think those are the so whether you call the relay and then, you call the 911 and they bring in someone to help, or they call the relay and then it goes to 911, the ideal would be that it would end up with a three-way call where there is direct communication with somebody assisting rather than the typical relay configuration. Thank you.
Thank you. Christian? This is Christian. I'd like to give you a heads up. I have a variety of comments, so please bear with me. I've got plenty of things to say. A short response to Joel and Greg. I think it's also important to remember that NG 911 is something that we're looking at 10 to 15 years down the line. And I expect that the relay service model will also change during that time. So I wouldn't be surprised if, there's some future version of relay that incorporates a standard of three-way communication where you're able to see the caller, the call taker, and the call receiver on the other end of the line. So that may be a standard that we see by the time we get to NG 911. So it's important to not make assumptions about today only, but also to think about what could be happening, developments in the future with VRS as well. For a brief comment in regard to what Sherry has said. Today, if you're to call 911 through a VRS provider, the interpreter has to ask for address information. And the reason being is if they don't know where you are when you place the call, they can't appropriately route you to your local 911 center or your nearest PSAP. So they must ask you for that information. There was more. I had 2 more points to make. Give me a sec to see if they come back. Right. I wanted to go back to the question about how many staff would be required in a specialized MCLS center. Donna said that that's something that should be dealt with in policy discussions, and I agree with that. Excuse me, I disagree with that. I think it's a scientific issue that needs to be tackled. Unfortunately, at this point, we don't have enough data. But it's very important for us to know how many 911 calls are routed through VRS, how often, and how long those calls typically last on average. So we know not only the average number of calls, but if there are certain spikes in volume at certain times, so that we can look at peak call times. We need the statistical tools, and we have those tools available, but we have not been gathered the data. So those tools would allow us to calculate ultimately how many staff would be required to handle not only the normal volume of calls, but any overflow. So I disagree that that's a policy issue. I think it's an issue of math, of numbers and science, and something that we could gather the data to look at. But I'm not sure who would necessarily be doing that, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily the FCC's responsibility. They are focused on the legal issues. So I think it's important for us to identify who within our community would be responsible for gathering that data and providing it to the FCC. So, and to make sure that the channels are open to allow us to gather that information. I believe the FCC is in a good position to be able to mandate that those companies are required to gather the data that's needed for us to make those kinds of calculations and ultimately policies. And there's one more thing. Just give me one more second to see if this one comes back too. I wanted to talk about the SIP issue. I wouldn't say that 911, that the FCC should mandate that VRS follow the SIP standard. I think that we're looking more to the NENA I3 standards, and I don't think that the SIP standards are sufficient. This is Richard. I want to caution you that we do have one more presentation on the TTY transitions on our agenda for today. And I really would love to make sure that we have time for that as well. So I'm going to ask that we limit our discussion, our current discussion, to 2 more comments so that we do have time to move on to the TTY presentation. I believe that Mark Stern was in the queue. And I think Bernard is in the queue on the phone. We'll go ahead with Bernard. I think he's first.
I just wanted to respond to Greg. I think your desire to have quick call setup is very important, and some of the call flows we've talked about previously would not necessarily provide that. So I think that may be something we may need to discuss more. Because, for example, there may be 2 call routing issues here. One is routing to the PSAP, and the other is routing to the interpreter. And if a call is routed directly to the PSAP and that results in a call out to the interpreter and then bridging the conference, there could be a call setup delay which could be significant. So I think we need to perhaps, somebody needs to get into a discussion of the call flows and the impact on the delays that Greg described.
This is Richard. I think Mark Stern is up next. Thanks. This is Mark Stern from Purple. And I wanted to follow up on Christian's comments regarding the collection of data for 911 calls. From my perspective as a VRS provider, I think it's pretty easy for us to gather that data. We already have to provide a very detailed call record. Our CDR call detail records that we provide to ROCA, the fund administrator, is very specific. A couple of years ago, there was a conference where there were a panel of VRS and IP relay providers. And someone in the audience, I believe, asked about the number of calls per week to 911. And I think among the VRS providers there, they said there were 500 to 600 calls per week at one point. So we would have to double check that information, but I think it would be fairly simple to ask the VRS and IP relay providers to tabulate that information and to provide it to the committee for their work. So I would definitely be in support of that process. This is Christian. I think we would need more details about the calls, not just the total number. And this is Mark. In our call detail record, we have that information, very specific. Richard saying to Chris, do you have any last words of wisdom to depart before we move on?
This is Chris speaking. Mark, thank you very much for that information, and I think other VRS providers will be able to provide the same information. Additionally, I know in the state of Florida, I have asked that our TRS provider, provide information as far as 911 calls made to TTYs or through TRS. So our state provider is working on that, and we should probably look about finding the same statistical information from the other states, because I think that information would be available.
This is Richard. Karen has a very, very brief question for us.
Okay. My question is to you, Christian. I'm just curious to know whether this is the kind of thing that the RERC on telecommunications access, or if not telecom access and maybe wireless access, could take on.
This is Christian speaking. So are you asking me if the FCC gave us the data, if we would be able to help to tabulate it?
No,
Or-
I'm more asking you if this is the kind of thing, this is a kind of data gathering effort that the RERC could engage in, the kind of study that you can engage in to acquire this, to collect this information from VRS providers and other providers potentially as well.
And this is Christian. I would say, my first guess is that yes, we'd be happy to participate, but we would need more, I would need to gather more information before I could give a clear yes or no. Chris has one last burning comment.
Okay, this is Chris again. I just wanted to make one quick comment regarding the comment that was made before. I'm not sure who made it, about the choice of whether or not you wanted to use VRS or direct connect to the PSAP. And I think that was a very valid point. However, I think that comes down to the methods of calling a PSAP. If you want to speak to an administrative line or a non-emergency number at a police department or a fire department, then that would be through relay services. But if you have an emergency situation that is a 911 emergency situation, then it should be direct connect to the PSAP. It's just like I was saying before, if a dispatcher receives a call from a hearing caller and that person gives no information and hangs up before that information is passed on, information from the ANI, ALI, and the PSAP is still coming to try to make contact and make sure that that person is okay. So I think it's important to differentiate that, yeah, there is two different ways that you can go about connecting to the PSAP, but if it's an emergency situation, then the opportunity should be there for direct connect.
Okay, I'm sorry, Mark, but I have to pull the plug on this here. We really need to move on to our next topic, because we also need to leave a little bit of time at the end of our meeting to talk about our future meeting schedules so that the FCC can arrange for interpreting services, captioning services, and all of those logistics. So we need to set aside a small bucket of time for that. Our next presentation is going to be from Gunnar Hellstrom, presenting about TTY transition issues. So let's pull up, I'm going to pull up your PowerPoint here, Gunnar.
Yes, please. And how much time can I devote to my presentation, Richard? Shall I be very brief, or can I take 20 minutes?
How much time can you give us? I'm sorry, Gunnar. Would 30 minutes be sufficient?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, 30 minutes.
Okay, great. And we have a little bit of wiggle room in there, too. but as long as we have at the very least 15 minutes left at the end of our meeting for discussion about our future meeting schedule.
Okay, so hope to get the slides up then.
Great. Let's see.
So I can start talking into it that I'm Gunnar.
All right, the floor is yours.
And I've been co-chair of this TTY transition group with the task to look at the opportunity to switch over from TTY to a new, more efficient way of communicating in real-time text and voice. And next slide, please. We got from the charter of the EAC a task to look at this. Can we close out the use of the TTY and get something more efficient into the system and use that for 911 calls and, of course, also for everyday calls, because we have said that it's important to have the same tools for everyday as for 911. So therefore, this study looks quite much at the everyday calling just as much as on 911 calling. And next slide, please. We inherited a couple of recommendations from the first EAC report. One saying that no, the main group did not want to have a phase-out deadline for the handling of TTYs in the PSAPs. They saw no reason and saw so much complexity in putting a deadline of that support. And they also wanted the Bordeaux support to be continued, but for the landline situation, it could be arranged that everybody get on to IP transmission for their real-time text and voice needs, and then, of course, you can relax the need for supporting the TTY in the PSAPs. And next slide, please. There is also a system for TTY attachment to handsets, especially for the wireless, and there is regulation requiring that, and we were tasked to look at if we could release or remove that requirement in exchange of a move over to a replacement of the TTY. And this question is, of course, valid for both the wireline and wireless, but it's very different situations for the wireline and wireless networks. Next slide, please. Our work plan, we have produced a draft already somewhere in September, and in December that was presented to the main group with a request to approve it. So after December we have distributed the drafts to the whole group with the request to have comments. And the last few days we got very valid comments from AT&T and have incorporated them in a draft final report. So right now we have a report that is kind of approved by the full group, but now when we got this extra month, I think it's a very good chance to get it further acknowledged, approved. So I want to take the same chance as the previous group to ask for further comments during a couple of weeks and finalize the report within the coming month. Next slide, please. We have a lot of chapters giving background, extracts from our survey, the survey that EAC used, and taking that as a background for what we should produce. We look at the current situation, and I think we skip this and look into the slides for each chapter. So next slide, please. Looking back to the EAC survey is alerting, and we got quite a lot interesting figures there. We must, of course, remember that this was not a statistical sample of people. It was interested people who responded. Anyway, if we look through what we found and what we can use as a base for designing this TTY replacement, we saw that 21% of those who was not able to use only voice for their calls. They used TTY for 911 calls. So TTY is still quite a lot used for 911 calls, and that may be because it's one of the few ways that our non-voice users can have for 911 calls. So having a replacement would, of course, offload this, but then the replacement must really fulfill the functional needs that make people use the TTY. And a scaring fact was that 25% of those who had reasons to call 911 could not complete the call. 30% of them failed. They tried but failed. The PSAPs could not understand them, or the call broke up or something. And 70% of these users had no way to call 911. So that is really scaring, and that is partly because the TTYs are so inconvenient, non-mobile, placed in the cupboard or thrown away, and people are there left without any means to call 911, and that's what we need to improve or repair. Among the ways to call, real-time text was the most favored method. About 45% of the respondents favored real-time text for text using. 40% wanted text both ways, 19% wanted text one way and voice the other way, and 22% wanted the captioned voice technology. That is, can we use for guidelines of how to compose a new service. Wireless solutions are very much favored for 911 calls, as we see also for hearing. But wireline is still important, so whatever we do must be possible to use for both wireline and wireless. And text and voice both ways is what is wanted without any inconvenient ways to switch between these two modalities. Next slide, please. So that background from the survey can be used for designing a replacement for the TTY. We can look at what the TTY is today. It is a kind of limited functionality for intermixing voice and a limited format real-time text, and it's integrated in the old telephone network. It has a lot of limitations, so that is partly the cause of its reduced popularity. It's slower than rapid typing. It has a limited character set. It only has a quite clumsy way to alternate between text and audio, so it doesn't combine text and audio in any modern convenient fashion. And there is no popular wireless solution. There is a wireless solution that requires you to hook up the TTY device with a cable to the mobile handset, and that is not what people want to have. But some of these features are important and are not yet provided by any other widespread solution in USA, so that is part of the reason why it's still kept. Even if the mix between voice and text is clumsy, it is a possibility to use text one way and voice the other, for example, and still reach people in the regular phone network. I have made very brief estimations of the use rate of TTYs, and these are estimations and extrapolations based on statistics that may be only taken for small areas or small groups and so on. So there may be quite large errors in these, but that's not the intention to be exact. It's just to get a glimpse of how big the population is and what size we are talking about. So the estimation lands on that there are about 100,000 users still in USA who have their TTY available and use them occasionally. About 20,000 911 calls per year for all of USA, which is, 20,000 is a reasonably big number to at least consider, but spread out on the 6,000 PSAPs, it is not much per PSAP. So that's why we have this discussion that it's gone and still being important. Looking at the everyday call use, it is about 18 million calls per year, user-to-user calls and relay calls. And about 36% of the text relay calls are done with TTYs. The other ones are done with the IP relay methods. We also have seen that if you try to hook up a TTY to a telephone port that happens to go into an IP network, a VoIP network, then there is a lot of observed communication problems, quality problems, sometimes no communication at all. So it's not just that we can just hook it on and continue to using the TTY. A replacement is needed. So the features are desired, but the implementation current has limitations. And there is, in fact, a room for replacement with modern technologies that also increase functionality. Next slide, please. So people are abandoning the TTY and people are keeping the TTY, so it might be good to know why this happened. Why would you like to keep this device? Well, it allows this intermixed voice and text, which is important for hard of hearing people and for speech disabled people and for 911 calls where the PSAP has help of hearing the sound environment behind the calling user. It is also kept just because it is the only direct link to 911, which is against our recommendation that you shall be able to call with whatever you use for everyday calling. It is in fact very robust. It's always ready. It can be used for 15 years with no service. So robust device, not like a PC or a smartphone that is only healthy for half a year and then it needs some update. There is also could be a reason that users have not bothered to look for other solutions. They have learned and been used to use this, and that's what they use for their calls. On the other side, why are they leaving it? Why are they abandoning? The limitations in mobility is, of course, apparent with this not so convenient wireless TTY solution. No one are carrying around their TTYs and connect to their mobile phones. The limited speed, the limited character set, the limited simultaneity of text and voice and text only in one direction at a time is also makes the communication a bit clumsy and limited. And when fewer people have the solution, there are fewer to call through it, so less opportunities to use it. Of course, when video phones came along, maybe 70% of the users jumped off and started to mainly use video phones. This reliability in VoIP connections must have thrown out some users. They moved to apartments with only VoIP and found that their TTYs couldn't work there anymore, and they didn't bother to replace it with anything. And of course, many alternatives pop up nowadays, and users get along with patchwork of different communication technologies, even if they don't provide the same functionality, not the same combination of voice and text or relay connection or so. They find a way to do their communication anyway. Next slide, please. We have seen transmission problems, so we cannot move directly over to VoIP. We see a multitude of reasons. Packet loss that appears in the VoIP networks strike TTY very much. We have said that 1% character loss is okay, but already if you lose 0.12% of packets in a regular VoIP transmission, then that limit is passed. So it's very sensitive to packet loss. It's also coding and audio handling sensitive, and echo cancelers can play in and destroy communication. We don't know the problem level. We haven't succeeded to collect any statistics on it. It's just hearsay that there are this kind of problems, but it's very apparent. So either we need to make more research, or we can just accept the fact and replace it with something better on IP. And the good thing is that technologies exist for making IP transport of, well, that is not a good thing. There exist some technologies to try to transport the old TTY over IP. They are very little implemented, and they, of course, don't improve the functionality of the TTY itself. So instead, we would like to see a replacement of the TTY which enhances functionality and is made for a native transmission in the IP environment. Next slide. So, when we design the TTY replacement, we have a list of functionality we want to have. We want to have smooth and rapid real-time text communication so that you have good connection, not messaging, which takes a lot of time, causes frustration and waiting. We need to have simultaneous voice and real-time text in the same call so that you can talk as much as possible and revert to text whenever it's needed in the call. We, of course, want a full character set. It need to be compatible, both wireless and fixed line. We need a robust transmission that is not hurt by a lot of errors. We need to use existing standards so that it can be rapidly deployed, and it need to be possible to use for user-to-user calls, for relay calls, and for NG 911 calls. We would like to have multi-party call capability, and since there are 100,000 users still using the TTY, we might want to have interoperability, have possibility to have calls with the TTYs, the old PSTN connected TTYs. There is also a reason to have video phones complemented with text and have text plus voice devices calling into video devices with text and finding that, okay, we have voice and text in common, so we use voice and text, but not video for that call. And we want them, of course, to be implemented in modern technology environments as mainstream as possible. But we must not forget the accessibility features like alerting in visual and tactile ways, having a visual indication of tones on the connection, having possibility to connect to screen readers for deafblind people, and so on. Next slide. And when we talk now about a TTY replacement, it is not definitely just a TTY with new transmission technologies. It may look whatever. It may be soft phones, it may be hard phones, it may be video phones with this capability, it may be wireless, and so on. So many shapes. It's just the transmission behind the box that is important to decide on and get agreement on so that we can start deploying this. Next slide. So, what can we do? What do we have today that can create this functionality? We see that technology is divided in different call control environments, and if we look at these major ones and see what is standardized, we find that it's of course best to find that something is already specified for NG 911. And we have the NINA I3 specification, and we have an IATF RFC 6443 that are in agreement about what to do, what to use for voice and real-time text. We have the native SIP environment defined, and we have some common audio codecs, for example G711, and for the real-time text there is T140 specified for communication on the presentation level, and RFC 4103 for RTP-based real-time text transmission. And that is what we have currently in these places and what is recommended to be used for the native SIP environment. Very similarly, we have in IMS the LTE and VoLTE environments, mainly for the mobile. GSMA have defined a profile called IR62, where the real-time text is defined in Annex B, and it is in fact the same kernel standards. It is just in the IMS environment, so it will be very easy to arrange interoperability with NG 911 and with native SIP from that environment. So that is a main currently standardized environments. Next slide. But we also have other call control environments, and you need to check what possibility you have to have real-time text and voice in them. It is not very likely that we will have other call control environments for NG 911. I think that will be SIP, possibly IMS, but having a lot of ways to call into 911 with other technologies is less likely to happen. So therefore, whatever other environments for real-time text and voice we define, they need to convert into SIP with RFC 4103 real-time text when they go into 911. One protocol that is currently mentioned in this area is to use XMPP, the instant messaging protocol XMPP, that has gained some popularity, and it has work on the way to make a real-time text implementation there, standard for. And that would be good because instant messaging has gained so much popularity, and it could gain even more by moving over to having a real-time text mode that would get away with the waiting in instant messaging. So that could be one, but very likely that will not go directly into NG 911, but need to be converted into NG 911 protocols. There is another area coming up now called RTC Web that is intended to provide web-based real-time communication, and it's urgent to get a real-time text method defined in that environment as well, but the same thought then to convert into NG 911 protocols when you have the 911 call. So when we see other call control environments, we need to have them convert to 911 protocols. We cannot expect the 911 center to accept to convert to Skype, convert to whatever. They need to take responsibility for the conversion. And the way to apply that requirement is maybe for FCC to consider. Next slide, please. So we can see that with this replacement of TTY, we can access NG 911 by the existing NINA and IETF protocols, and they were successfully tested in the ICE5 test in October last year. We had real-time text and voice and video calls there. And so it's just to remember to implement these standards and make real, on the 911 side, make true real-time text operation, combine voice and text in the same call, even combine with video, arrange so that they can do the transfer and recording and multi-party calls as they can do with voice and video. So all media must follow such operations. I realize that in the callback there must be some guidance for what text protocol to use, because there are already 3 methods or 4 methods of text communication defined in the NG 911 specifications, and there must be some guidance for selecting the proper one. And even when you have TTY or TTY replacement or messaging on the user side, you need some guidance for how to behave as a call taker, and you need technical guidance because the calls will not be very many, and if you have multiple ways to do text, you can't really know a lot of how you need to behave in these cases. You need guidance. Next slide, please. When we have a TTY replacement in place, there will be cases when users of the old TTY want to have a call with a TTY replacement. And making a gateway for that is itself no big challenge. Such gateway exists. It can be done in terminals, but maybe rather in gateways. But to get such a gateway functionality into the call path in every case is more of a challenge. So the report provides proposals and recommendations for various ways to get such gateways into the call path between TTYs and TTY replacement, but we haven't decided which one is best. We leave to the FCC to try to decide for us what, and it also depends on how far you want to go with this interoperability. Next slide, please. We also know that mainstream, it would be good if the TTY replacement also became a mainstream feature. Mainstream features are attractive because they reach many users. You can call many users with them. But, of course, in order to make use of them, you need the accessibility features in them to have alerting, real-time text, and so on. So if we could convince mainstream providers to have a good real-time text and voice in the mainstream provision, it would be best. Next slide, please. So the ways to make that happen is to base TTY replacement on mainstream technology, which the standards show. EAC has indication that it will gain mainstream popularity. We had a presentation from RIM investigating how users picked up real-time text, and it was dominating positive for using real-time text over instant messaging. So if it's provided, it can become popular. So it should be provided, it should be trialed, it should be launched with mainstream provider services, but combined with accessibility features. Next slide. So what regulation support do we need to get this off the ground? There is similar tendency in the section 255, 508 refresh that is done by the Access Board, and we need to recommend a synchronization with them, at least define the same standards. And we also need to remember that whatever is defined should be possible to use for ANG 911. Next slide. We can also discuss relaxing of the TTY connection requirement so that it gets a benefit, especially for the wireless connection, but also for wireline, that when there is a good replacement out there, you could stop providing a connection possibility for the TTYs on the VoIP or IP devices. But probably maintain the interoperability requirement to the old TTYs if the features for that is find feasible. Next. And we have identified a lot of entities that will be influenced by this move, and I don't want to go into them. It's both manufacturers and providers of different kinds who need to adopt this TTY replacement. Next slide. The timeline is proposed to first settle what the replacement is, as we have recommended. It must be adopted somewhere, and then start deployment, and this can happen within 18 to 24 months. The TTY phase out does not have to have a fixed deadline. If not, the move to IP in the core network causes communication problems. So the TTYs can still be used where they are, but not be brought into IP communication. Still aim at having all new users having the replacement system after at least 7 years, maybe shorter. And next slide. And there was also in the report, there is another deadline, 14 years for after that maybe we can close any support of the old TTY. And I think that brought up all the recommendations. So we have in the report ending with a lot of conclusions and recommendations, but the presentations made it clear what it is. So I think I end with the proposal to approve after this extra month we talked about, approve the transition report and be prepared to contribute to decision material and implementation of this better way to do real-time text and voice that users deserve. Thanks.
And thank you. I'd like to pass it over to Norm Williams. That was a wonderful presentation. It was very informative, and I do appreciate it. I do have one comment that might have been overlooked, I'm not sure, but it is in regards to the standards for showing whether or not it is a full or half duplex used to support the users and how they are typing the messages. For example, if there's a TTY call that is, if you are typing, the other user cannot type at the same time. They must wait until you have completed a thought. With RTT, I believe that both people can type at the same time. Right now, with the PSAPs, they are being trained to interrupt TTY, to not interrupt TTY callers while they are typing their messages. If you're using RTT to RTT, you might be stuck in your old ways of waiting for the other caller to finish their comment. So we're hoping that there can be some sort of standard implemented where there can be a box on the screen that says, you can proceed with your comment now, someone is typing at this point, and if not, that is something that should be developed, because if not, we're going to be stuck in our old ways if we are going to make the transition to RTT to RTT.
Yes.
Gunnar?
Yeah, Gunnar here. Yes, that was very briefly mentioned that the PSAP call taker needs support to handle the different ways of text communication. And this is one way that you need both education and technology support for understanding and not abusing the way to communicate between different methods. And Norman, want to say something more?
Should that be part of the protocol standards? It should be incorporated there. It wouldn't require any sort of education, but it would be part of the new protocol.
Yes, it definitely needs protocol support, and there is a draft for a standard for that as a little parameter saying what kind of text communication you have. It is not yet approved, but it is in IETF. It can be picked up and moved on to approval. It's also a matter of the gateways helping to serialize the communication. And this is a matter, in fact, also for the idea to use legacy PSAPs for SMS, which has a great risk if you try to do SMS transmission with conversion into TTY, that you happen to obstruct this rule of not communicating in the same time in both ways, and you suddenly lost the message from the SMS. That needs to be very well developed, and resending method and policing of this communication if it's ever feasible to use the TTY for SMS transmission. But that's another story.
This is Richard speaking. I do want to ensure that we leave some room for our discussion on our next meeting. We have 4 people in our queue. They are Donna, Mark Fletcher, Bernard, and Mark saying, and this is Richard. Okay, then Mark, put your hand down. We also have Bernard and Christian who would like to comment. So now I'd like to move to Donna. Donna? Donna speaking. Thank you, Gunnar, for really giving us such an in-depth account about the TTY transition. I do have a few comments that I'd like to share with you now. You are correct in that there is a problem using only a VoIP line for the TTY. There are issues there, of course. The reason being is because more and more deaf individuals are purchasing bundles for their homes because it's cheaper. So they can get the phone line, the internet, also cable included in one price. And often the phone line is VoIP. So if they're bundling, there is still an issue there. So that's just for your information. Also, there are people out in rural areas that do not have an internet connection. Meaning, when their areas finally do install those types of connections, we have no idea when that'll be. Regarding the National Broadband Plan, we're not sure about the timeline there. We're not sure when the entire U.S. will be covered with broadband access. So that's something to look at as well. That's something that we can't remove from the plan now. What is that? We can't eliminate the use of a TTY until an analog equipment is no longer used. Because of the telebraille that might be used by blind callers, there are a variety of individuals that use different things that require the analog system. So that is something to keep in mind as well. And also, if we're going to be making a transition to some different type of equipment for NG911, it is imperative that we make sure that it's user-friendly. We know that many people out there will be apprehensive in adapting a new type of technology, will be easily overwhelmed, and then will not even try to use it or adopt it. We want to ensure that it is user-friendly for those reasons and something that they can become accustomed to very quickly. The individuals who have hearing loss are going to have to learn how to use them later in life, or have learned how to use them. And so if it's a new technology, they might be hesitant. That really is something to take into consideration, and I just wanted to put that out there for you. Bernard, are you on the line? Also, thank you, Donna.
I wanted to mention three things. One was the impact of TTY on the silent call procedure. Gunnar, as you mentioned, there are only a few TTY 911 calls per PSAP, but there are many more silent calls, and the process for that requires TTY probing. And so when we move to text, SMS to 911, I think we need to rethink as what the silent call procedure will be, and whether something else like, for example, text back to the silent caller might make sense. So that's one aspect of on the PSAP side. So the PSAP may be affected even if there's still a requirement to support TTY. The operational procedure may need to change. The second thing is for a wireless handset, I do think that we need to examine the TTY phase-out potentially sooner because it is not very well used today, and keeping that requirement there for essentially indefinitely seems probably not a very good use of resources. And the third aspect is considering, I know in the text to 911 FNPRM, there's a discussion of various ways of handling text to 911 calls other than the TTY, and might make sense to look at some of those. For example, we have seen the web used as a way of giving the dispatcher a better way to handle those text to 911 calls than something like TTY.
And Christian. And then we'll move to Matt after Christian's comment. This is Christian speaking. I would like to thank you, Gunnar, for that wonderful report. And I do want to let you know that as of now, the FCC has an open process, open proceeding on the POTS system transferring to IP. And that is due on January the 28th. Comments are due on January the 28th. I strongly believe that report will become record. And now, Matt Gerst, this will be our final comment. You've been warned.
Thank you, Richard. Matt Gerst, the CTIA. Thanks. I just want to elaborate a little bit more on Bernard's point about the wireless TTY situation. I think this report from the previous versions has moved a long way in sort of distinguishing between TTYs, which are clearly being, at least in some respects, used in the wireline context, but not very much so in the wireless context, particularly for 911 emergency communications. And so one of the things that Bernard said, which I think it's going to be important looking at this report going forward, is how this continuation of wireless TTY relates to the recommendations on text communications to 911, the other report that we've already been looking at, and whether that could be sort of a bridge between the wireless TTYs we know aren't being utilized right now and going on to the TTY full replacement in an NG911 environment. So I think that's just something that this report would do well to consider. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. All right. Do we have a final word of wisdom from you, Gunnar?
Yeah, thanks, Gunnar here. Yes, in response to Matt, it is important to distinguish between the TTY replacement and SMS to 911. SMS to 911, as we have reported, does not at all cover all use cases for TTY replacement. on the other hand, as you say, the current wireless TTY solution is so inconvenient so that it's not used, so dropping it will not kill many users. So something can be discussed, but the real replacement also in the wireless area is, of course, very important, where you have the voice and the real-time text.
Okay, I'd like to send it over to Mark now. Mark, you will be the last one, and then we will move on. Mark?
No, that was Paul.
I'm sorry. Sorry, Paul. Paul Michaelis?
With Avaya, I want to make a couple of quick points. First of all, within Avaya, we are very enthusiastic about the RFC 4103 protocol that Gunnar mentioned. We see many applications for real-time text as a component of voice telephone calls outside of the area of disability access. Just as an example, you can envision calling into two different teleconferences at the same time, participating by voice in one conference while getting the streaming captions of the other conference on the display of your phone. And so, again, we are moving forward with RFC 4103 based implementations, not just for disability access, but because we see it of tremendous usefulness for the general population. The other point I wanted to make is to reemphasize a comment that Gunnar made earlier. It is essential in a 911 application that whatever text mechanism you have must include an audio channel. You cannot have just pure text without endangering the user, and also making sure that people that rely on voice carryover, hearing carryover are accommodated. That's it for me.
Thank you, Paul. And now we need to wrap this up as we only have a few minutes remaining. We have a few announcements, and then we also need to discuss when we will plan our next meeting. The month of July is 6 months out, so I don't know if we would like to schedule a meeting for next month in person. What's your pleasure? Jean-Paul?
Thank you. Given that we've got a 30-day window for comments to come back to at least the 3 reports that we've heard today, I don't think we should be meeting any time before then, for sure. And I would think that the 4 groups that need to provide information have at least 30 days now. They've been put on notice, so to speak, from today's meeting, that they could provide us input. I would not have a meeting scheduled until we actually had something on an agenda to discuss. So I would not be looking forward to a meeting, either audio, video, or face-to-face, for at least until the latter part of March, if not early April.
Okay, do we have any further comments? Any thoughts, considerations to add?
Bernard Aboba. I have a comment, which is that the text to 911 comment period, I believe, ends on March 11th or something like that. And I do think it would be useful to get some of these reports submitted into that proceeding. So that would suggest some kind of meeting to approve them for that purpose.
Okay, Christian? This is Christian speaking, and I'd like to echo that comment. I think it's very important that those reports are put on the record. And I do have another brief announcement as well. I spoke with Brian Daly from AT&T and also Roger Hickson from NENA. And we all agree that we'd like to move forward with working group number 5. We are looking at the NENA I3 standards. And next week, I will be sending an email to the full committee asking you if you'd be interested in joining us with that, and we're hoping to proceed very quickly. So just wanted to put that out there. Eric?
Yeah, but the full.
I just want to understand how we're supposed to provide feedback on these reports. So, for example, I'll look at Chris's report and I'll look at Gunner's report. I've been involved with Subcommittee 1, so I know that report. Are we just individually sending our comments to you guys, or is there a more formal process to provide feedback?
Gunnar?
Gunnar here. Yeah, I expected the coming month to be divided in 3 steps or so, and having our final approval in a month's time, saying that we take 2 months for general input from everybody, 2 weeks, I mean, of course, and 1 week for making a final proposed revision, and 1 week for verifying an approval, and something like that. Still input from anybody. I haven't thought about any more formal handling.
Okay, so this is Eric. So if I understand you, Gunnar, the next 2 weeks you'd like us to provide you feedback. Then there would be a week where you would integrate any of that feedback into your report, and then there would be one final week for everybody to just give it one more look-see. Not making comment on that, I mean, my question was, how do you want us to provide you feedback? Do you just want me, if we read it, just send you directly an email saying this is my feedback, or is there a more formal way you want me to present you that feedback, if I have any?
Can we ask back, are there other proposals so that we can end up with an agreed version? I can realize that we get into a bounce back situation when we do edits that some people are not happy with, but others are, and so on, and we will not get final approval by the final day. So what other procedure can we have?
Joel asked a question.
Sorry.
This is Richard. I'd like to send it over to Matt Gerst.
Thanks, Matt Gerst with CTI. I'm not going to actually answer a question about the process yet. I actually want to go back to the point about if we're trying to line up the reports with the FCC's comment deadlines for the Text 911 FNPRM. I was wondering if we can get clarification on those dates, because I think there was a date that was mentioned. It's only in reference to to only one portion of the comment dates. So, thanks. Yes, Mr. Chair. Okay, thank you. Yes, the actual reply and comment dates for the FNPRM are March 11th and April 9th. But the bounce back issue itself, that issue has been segregated, and that comment period is January 29th and February 8th. So, and I just wanted to say, from the FCC standpoint, we would like to get those comments into the March 11th comment period. So, to the best of the committee's ability to get that forward, that would be great. Thank you. So, this is Matt.
Okay, Matt.
Sounds like then, if we're trying to meet that March 11th deadline, we really do only have about 30 days, 45 days or so. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. So now we can probably talk about process, but I just want to make sure we are clear on the deadlines. Thank you.
This is Eric again. So I was asking the question, so I'm not sure what the process is. That's why I was throwing it out to the group, how we wanted to handle that as far as providing feedback. I don't really have an idea. I kind of I'm not sure about the actual date, 1 week bifurcation or whatever, but I do like the idea of providing feedback, integrating it, and giving everybody one last quick look-see. I think that's good for sanity's sake. Again, I'm just trying to figure out how you want us to provide the initial feedback. I'm
Joel?
open to any suggestions.
Joel Zev?
Joel, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the way the committee work that I was on, I thought was superb, and I would suggest following the same way. People would send in editing versions of the Microsoft to a key person who integrates the comments into one document. The committee then meets and goes through each of the comments really fast, makes a go, no-go decision or other changes, and then you have a finished product by the end of the meeting. To try to integrate loose comments on a separate sheet just becomes an overwhelming task for documents of this size. GA.
All right. Christian? Excuse me, Donna? This is Donna speaking. I would appreciate any comments from the full committee that they'd be willing to share, and they can be as brief as you'd like them to be. I was thinking maybe a 2-week time period. And once those have been collected, Chris and I will be able to send that version to experts outside of the EAAC to find some sort of feedback from them as well. And then in another 2 weeks, we would send out the revised document, is something that I would prefer to do, because I'd like to have individuals who are outside of our full committee on board and included in the process. I wouldn't mind if we meet every month, the first or second Friday, whatever it may be. I guess it just depends on the content of each individual working group and how they feel. I know that Nina will be developing a conference working group. Their development conference working group, will be February 10th to the 13th, and that's taking place in Orlando, Florida. And what they're discussing there will also cover what we're discussing here. I'm not sure if there are other individuals that plan to go. I do encourage you to do so. We'd love to hear any sort of feedback that you might have and encourage participation for that. Thank you, Donna. This is Richard. Did I see another hand? Okay, Christian?
This is Christian here. I just have a brief comment. And it's in response to what Joel said. I definitely agree with his comments. In the past, working with CISRIC, with Working Group 1, had a very similar process where we collected feedback from everyone individually. And then our subcommittee met again to go through each piece of feedback and decide whether or not it was incorporated. And then once we had that final draft, we sent it out for a last review. And that has also worked very well for us in compiling the Text to 911 document. This is Richard. Okay. I'm watching the time very carefully. Chris, you wanted to add something?
I agree with that. I think to answer Eric's original question, send the feedback to the co-chairs of each subcommittee, and then each subcommittee co-chair sort through the feedback within the subcommittee, and then a week or 2 weeks before we meet again, we'll send another draft with updated feedback. So hopefully that helps get out of the weeds within a couple of weeks anyway.
Yeah, this is Eric. Just one last comment. That sounds really great. And then as far as face-to-face meetings, can I just suggest any further face-to-face meetings should take place in Hawaii?
Amen, brother.
This is Richard. I second that. And you're footing the bill, is that right? T-Mobile's, sponsoring. This is Richard. I think we do need to wrap up. Would you like to meet in February? In person, or would you rather stretch it to March 8th? That would be 3 days prior to the deadline for comments. That's cutting it pretty close.
Richard?
Yes.
This is Lori Flaherty. I've had my hand up for a while. Just moving backwards from the deadline.
My apologies.
No problem. As a practical matter, moving backwards from the deadline, having worked on these reports before, it would be good if the authors had about a week to make any suggested edits as these reports are being accepted and approved by the larger group. So if we could schedule our next large meeting at least a week before that deadline, anything previous to that I think is sort of up for discussion and would give people more time to work on the documents. But that, I think that's sort of a hard deadline.
Thank you, Laura. I'm actually looking at the calendar. So 1 week prior would be March 1st. That Friday, but it should give us a week prior to the deadline. Are we in agreement? Would you all like to meet on March 1st?
This is Brian Daly. Just a point, I've got that on my calendar. The CSUN conference is that week. I don't know if that impacts anybody out in San Diego.
This is Norm. We've got to check room availability. Richard is saying, I hope the room that we meet in here at the FCC will be available, but why don't we aim for March 1st? Christian is saying, is it okay to conflict with the CSUN conference? Is that going to be a problem? Richard saying, I don't think that's going to be an issue. Brian, this is Richard. You're saying that conference is the same week?
This is Brian. Yes, I was just pointing it out. It wasn't an issue necessarily for me, but I know many attend that conference, and I just wanted to point it out. It's that week.
So who in the room, I guess, wants to continue with a March 1st date to aim for March 1st? Do I see consensus here?
This is Joe. I'm at another conference that same day. He won't be able to participate.
Okay. We're trying to find a date that works best for the majority of folks. So,
of course,
it looks like March 1st. Can we agree to March 1st? Okay, let's go with that. I think we've got a couple announcements. Susie has an announcement and maybe one other person. I'm going to turn it over to Susie. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. Appreciate it. I do want to let you know that hot off the press, I just got the extension of the charter, the release of the PN. So I will make sure I go ahead and send that to you via email as well, so that you can see the official announcement that the charter has been extended. And thank you to many people internally for getting that done. March 1st may not work for us in terms of being able to book this room. So we may need to pick a backup date. I will talk with Richard about that later, and he will get in touch with you. Those are the announcements. Thanks. Jean-Paul has something?
Does it have to be face-to-face? If we can do it as a teleconference, video conference, that's fine as well. So it would be better if we had a set date that we know we can put in our calendars now, so that there won't be a conflict. And since we're all in kind of a consensus that the March 1st date is pretty good for the majority, I would hate to lose the date. I would hate to lose more members by changing a date because we had to meet face-to-face.
Just Richard. Okay. Does that seem doable for everyone? We could potentially do a teleconference if that's easier. Okay, we will work out the details. I will make sure I work it out with the folks at the FCC. This is Norm. I would suggest meeting in person on March 1st if this room is available, and if not, then, as Jean-Paul said, keeping the date, but meeting via teleconference or video conference. And Christian has something to add. This is Christian. I know I've already said this, but I'd like to just reiterate. We are going to proceed as working group number 5 in reviewing the NENA I3 standards. And I will be distributing an email next week asking that if you are interested in participating with that working group that you reply so that we can set a schedule to get moving. Thank you. I see someone with their hand raised online. I don't know if it's Laura Rudy. I see a Laura on the line. Okay, we'll move to Gunnar.
Yeah, Gunnar here. Just a short question. Do people in the full group bother if we distribute questions on mail in the whole group? Do you regard it to be spam if you get mail about things that you are not very interested in? Can we use the whole group for the rest of the procedure? Any protest if I send to the whole group TTY things that you are not bothering about? I see no protest, so I will continue sending to what I think is the whole group. I'm so used to getting over-flooded by mail from a lot of groups and can sort out, so I hope everybody can do that. Good?
This is Richard. Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if David Zumba wants to add anything before we officially close. David, are you with us?
Joel, I have one comment regarding the follow-up.
Okay, Joel?
Can we just get a succinct email just on who the contact people should be for responses or any questions or comments on each of the reports?
Sure, we can do that. Thank you. We have another comment here. Yes, Brian.
Hi, I don't think David's on the line anymore, so just from TIA as a co-chair, thank you very much, everyone, today for your time and participation, and if we could, if, as you mentioned, we'd circulate the co-chair letter, just make sure we do that, and thank you.
Will do. Thank you. Okay, everyone. If there are no public comments, do we have any public comments? Chris? Chris, I wanted to thank our service providers, the interpreters, and also our cart writer. We don't want to forget them. Susie says, and we thank you, Richard, as co-chair. Again, we thank T-Mobile and TCS for their refreshments, breakfast and lunch, and I officially call the meeting to an end. Have a wonderful weekend and safe flight home. Thank you, everyone.